I never thought I would find peace working nights in a place like this. Most people wouldn't even call it a job, they'd call it a punishment. But for me, walking the long, empty corridors of the old Marston office building felt almost quiet, almost safe, in a way that daytime could never offer. The elevator smelled faintly of rust and dust when I stepped out on the fifth floor, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam across the cracked linoleum. It was just after midnight, and the city outside was asleep, or at least that's what I told myself. In truth, the emptiness inside these walls often felt heavier than the streets ever could. I checked my watch as I began the first round. 11:45. Not too late, not too early. The offices were long abandoned, the cubicles half collapsed, their chairs swallowed by layers of dust. I had worked here for 3 months now, and every night the same thought crept in. No one else would ever see this place like I do. The peeling wallpaper, the old coffee stains on the carpet, the fluorescent lights that hummed just a little too low, it all belonged to me alone tonight. It started subtly. At first I thought it was just my imagination. I felt it in the back of my mind, that sense of being watched, something that I couldn't quite see. I shrugged, adjusting my flashlight. "You're tired," I muttered to myself. That's all. But then I noticed the details. The office doors were all closed as they should be, yet the third one down on the left, the one I passed every night without a second thought, was slightly ajar. Not fully open, just a crack, and I was certain I had closed it earlier. I stopped, leaning my weight on the worn railing that separated the main hall from the old stairwell. I listened. The building was still. Only my own breathing sounded in my ears and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. I pushed the door gently with the tip of my flashlight and it didn't move. Just as I had thought, it was stuck in the frame. A draft, maybe, shifting it just enough to appear open. I shook my head and moved on, convincing myself that was all it was. My steps echoed through the hall. There was a rhythm to it, a cadence that usually calmed me, but tonight it made me uneasy. I reached the old mailroom where faded notices still hung on the walls, curling at the edges. As I passed, I thought I saw something flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving behind the stacks of unopened letters. I froze. "Probably a coat or a jacket," I whispered to myself. My own voice sounded strange, too loud in the silence. But when I turned, nothing was there. Only dust, the way it caught in the beam of my flashlight, floating gently in the air like it had always been there. I kept walking, trying to focus on the routine. Check the stairwell, the restrooms, the elevator shafts. Every door, every hallway, every quiet corner. Routine was supposed to calm me. It had for months. But tonight something was different. There was a weight pressing down, a sensation I couldn't name. Something just beyond the edge of my vision, slipping between reality and imagination. In the break room, I paused. The coffee machine was still unplugged, the water cooler dusty, the sink stained from years of neglect. But on the counter, I thought I saw a cup, a paper cup full of water sitting where it shouldn't have been. I leaned closer. No, it was empty. And yet I had not seen it before. The thought struck me sharply. Had I walked past it before? Or had it appeared now somehow in the few moments I wasn't looking? I swallowed, trying to steady my heartbeat. "It's nothing. You're tired," I repeated. But the words felt weak, like a blanket with holes in it. As I moved toward the stairwell, I heard it. A faint creak, like the slow, measured step of someone walking behind me. I froze, letting my flashlight hover in the air. Silence. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3, nothing. The building had always groaned at night, but this wasn't the usual creak of settling beams. This was deliberate, slow, watching. I told myself it was a rat, maybe, or the old plumbing, but even as I thought it, my stomach knotted. I could almost feel it, a presence lingering just beyond the edge of the light, patient, silent, waiting. The stairwell was dark, narrower than it should have been, the metal steps rattling faintly under my weight. As I descended, I had the odd impression that the hallway above had stretched longer, that the elevator lobby I had just left was somehow farther away than it had been moments ago. My mind played tricks on me. I blinked. The building was silent, save for my own breath. At the bottom, the lobby felt different, more open yet somehow smaller. I noticed the exit doors again, locked. I always double-checked them at the start of my shift. They were supposed to be locked, but tonight the locks looked old, worn, like someone had been tampering with them. I approached carefully, my flashlight beam shaking slightly. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, and yet the sense of being observed pressed down heavier than ever. I sighed, rubbing my face. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a figure standing just outside the range of my flashlight. It was gone when I looked directly at the spot, but the sense remained. I was not alone. I was being watched, not by a person, not by anything human. I realized slowly, almost horrified at the thought. Something lingered in the air, patient, quiet, following me through each step. I went back to my patrol route, trying to ignore it, trying to reason it away. I told myself the mind plays tricks during long nights, that the imagination runs wild when the world is empty. But the shadows moved differently tonight. They weren't bound by the angles of the walls or the furniture. They flickered in the corner of my vision, always retreating when I looked directly. By 2 a.m, the building felt alive in a way it never had before. Not with people, not with sound, but with waiting. It was breathing around me, inhaling every step, exhaling every heartbeat. I paused near the old conference room where the dust hung thick and the ceiling tiles had collapsed years ago. A long table stretched out, littered with papers and debris. And at the far end, for a brief, impossible instant, I thought I saw a face, pale, motionless, staring at me. I froze, my mouth dry, my hands trembling slightly. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. Nothing remained but dust, floating lazily in the narrow beam of my flashlight. I told myself to calm down, to finish my rounds and get back to the security office. Only 2 more floors, I thought, only 2 more. But the floors seemed longer tonight. Each hallway stretched farther than it should, each door slightly different. The building had shifted while I wasn't looking. In the elevator lobby on the 4th floor, I paused. The elevator was still out of order, the sign blinking red. That was normal. But this time the emergency phone was off the hook. No dial tone, just static and faintly whispering. I held my flashlight steady, listening. I could almost make out the words, but they dissolved before I could understand. I left it, hurried down the hall, trying to ignore the feeling crawling up my spine. The security office was just ahead. I could see it, through the small window in the door. The glow of the computer monitor, the familiar clutter of paperwork and keys. Almost there, almost safe. As I stepped inside, I locked the door behind me. The sense of being watched did not leave me. It lingered, pressed against the walls, curled around the desk, seeped through the vent above my head. I took a deep breath, trying to settle my thoughts, trying to tell myself I was alone. But I was. I could feel it waiting beyond the thin walls, patient, watching, and somehow I knew this night was only the beginning. The halls of the Marston office building had always had their own rhythm. The echo of my footsteps on the cracked linoleum was familiar, like a metronome keeping me company during the long nights. But tonight, that rhythm felt wrong. Too long, too hollow, like the building itself was stretching in ways I couldn't see. I moved carefully, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam along the walls as I patrolled the 5th floor again. The air was still, heavy with dust and the faint scent of old coffee. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, their hum steady but slightly uneven, like a low pulse. I could feel the vibration in my chest, subtle, almost comforting, until it was. I rounded the corner to the main hallway, the one that led to the elevators and the stairwell, and froze. There was a sound. Faint, soft, deliberate footsteps. Not mine. They echoed just ahead, perfectly timed, slow. I swallowed. My throat felt dry. "Hello," I whispered, though I didn't expect an answer. The hallway was supposed to be empty. Always empty. Only the occasional rat or a settling board moved here. But the footsteps continued, soft and steady, just ahead of me, then stopping when I slowed. I raised my flashlight, shining it down the length of the corridor. Nothing. I forced myself to take a step forward. The sound followed. Stop, step, stop. I gripped the flashlight tighter, knuckles white. It was impossible. There was no one there. And yet I could feel the weight of eyes on me, invisible but real. My pulse quickened, and for the first time I considered leaving, retreating to the security office where the locked doors felt like protection. But curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, kept me moving. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small handheld camera I used for recording my rounds. The battery was nearly full, and the red recording light blinked quietly. I pointed it down the hallway and walked slowly, deliberately, capturing every inch of the floor, every door, every shadow. As I reviewed the feed on the screen, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A shadow flitted across the hallway behind me, quick, almost a blur. I turned, shining the flashlight. Nothing. The beam stretched down the corridor, illuminating the peeling wallpaper and the dusty carpet, and yet the shadow didn't exist in the light. It was as if it belonged only to the camera. I walked a few steps back and forth, recording again. The shadow appeared, faint and fleeting, disappearing each time I tried to look directly at it. I exhaled sharply. My mind raced for explanations. Could it be a reflection? A trick of the light? Fatigue? Maybe. But it didn't feel like imagination. It felt deliberate, patient, watching. The hallway seemed longer now. I could swear the far end stretched farther than before. Doors I remembered passing were now slightly out of place, misaligned. My own steps echoed louder than usual, each footfall reverberating like a drumbeat in the emptiness. And then, just as I reached the far corner, I heard it again. A whisper, soft, almost indecipherable, curling around my ear like a mist. I stopped, holding my breath. It wasn't a word, not exactly. Just a sound, a vibration, a suggestion of voice. My hand shook as I lifted the flashlight to illuminate the corner. Nothing moved. The hallway was empty, the shadows still and heavy. I started walking again, slower this time, recording the rest of the floor. My light fell on the office doors, closed as usual, yet some seemed slightly different. The frames warped, or maybe it was my mind. But one door, the old accounting office, was open just a crack, its interior swallowed in darkness. I remembered closing it last night. Or did I? My memory felt shaky. I shook my head, focusing on the camera feed. As I reviewed the recordings, I noticed something else. A figure, indistinct, flickering near the stairwell door. No features. Just an outline, too pale, too smooth, almost like smoke or mist, shaped like a person. And each time I turned my flashlight in that direction, nothing was there. But the camera caught it, always just beyond the edge of the light. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was probably a trick of the lens, a reflection from the hallway lights. But the sensation of being watched grew heavier, pressing against my back, curling around my legs, settling into my chest. I could feel it in every nerve, in every muscle, a presence that wasn't supposed to exist in a building as empty as this. I continued down the hall, keeping the camera recording. The floors creaked under my weight, soft groans that sounded like sighs. Occasionally, the fluorescent lights flickered, plunging the hallway into shadows that seemed to twitch unnaturally. I told myself it was the old wiring, that it had always done that. But tonight, it felt deliberate, malicious, waiting. When I reached the stairwell door, I paused. The shadows in the corner moved. Not fast, not erratic, just enough to suggest life, enough to make my stomach knot. I leaned closer to the camera screen, zooming in. There it was again. The outline of a figure drifting silently along the wall just outside the light. I shivered, forcing myself to breathe steadily. The stairwell was always my favorite part of the rounds. Confined, narrow, the metal stairs rattling gently, the walls close. It gave a sense of security, even when the rest of the building seemed to stretch unnaturally. I descended slowly, camera recording, flashlight illuminating each step. Halfway down, I felt it again. The gaze, not from a person, not from anything human, just awareness, present and deliberate. At the bottom, the hallway leading to the loading dock seemed longer than usual. I had walked it 100 times. Every floor had its quirks, but tonight, the end of the corridor felt impossibly far. I walked, counting my steps in my head, and yet the door at the far end remained out of reach. Shadows clung to the edges of the walls, shifting as I moved, never fully visible, never leaving the corners. I stopped near the exit, holding my breath. The whispering returned, soft, curling into my ear, wrapping around my skull. I could almost make out letters, fragments of words, but the sense of understanding eluded me. I wanted to run, to flee to the security office, to lock myself in, but my legs felt leaden, heavy, rooted to the floor. The camera in my hand felt warm, almost alive. I zoomed in on the screen, and there it was again. Not a shadow this time, but a hand. Pale, thin, impossibly long fingers curling around the edge of a doorframe. It vanished the moment I turned my flashlight toward it, leaving only the peeling paint and the empty hallway. My pulse raced. I forced myself to keep moving, my own voice whispering encouragements I didn't believe. "It's nothing. Just the building. You're alone." But the words were hollow. I felt a presence following me, lingering just behind in the gaps between the light, waiting for the moment I faltered. By the time I returned to the security office, my hands shook. The recordings were still running, capturing every shadow, every flicker, every whisper I could not explain. I reviewed them quickly, heart pounding, and saw what I had already glimpsed. Shapes that didn't belong, movements too deliberate for dust or wind. And the whispers, they weren't on the audio feed, not clearly, just faint static, almost human, curling around the edges of the sound. I sat back in the chair, trying to calm myself. The office felt like a sanctuary, yet even here, the building pressed against me, patient, waiting. I knew I wasn't imagining it entirely. Something followed me, moved with me, observed me, and it wasn't going away. The night stretched on. My rounds continued, but I stayed closer to the office, flashlight low, camera recording. Every creak, every whisper, every flicker of shadow reminded me of what I had seen, of what I had felt. I wasn't alone, and the building knew it. I knew it. And somewhere deep inside, I knew I would never see it, not fully, not clearly, and that perhaps I was meant to walk these halls forever, the silent witness to something patient, watching, waiting. By the time I returned to the stairwell on the third floor, something had changed. The air was heavier, thick in a way that made each breath deliberate. I hadn't noticed it at first, too absorbed in my patrol, too focused on the faint whispers and shadows. But now it pressed in from all sides, subtle and insistent. I reached the stairwell door and tried the handle. Locked. I frowned. That wasn't unusual in itself. Sometimes the old mechanisms jammed. But I had just walked down these stairs and the door had opened easily then. Now it refused to budge. I rattled it, tugged, even slammed my shoulder against it lightly. Nothing. Not a single movement. A chill ran down my spine. I stood there, leaning against the cold metal frame, listening. The building was silent, or so it seemed, but beneath the silence was something else. A faint hum, almost imperceptible, vibrating through the walls. And then the whispers returned. Soft, curling around my head, almost like someone leaning close to speak in my ear, yet no one was there. I stepped back, feeling the floor tilt slightly under me. The hallway outside the stairwell stretched longer than it should, doors that were familiar now oddly misplaced. I blinked, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. The light above flickered, and for a moment I could swear the shadows along the walls weren't shadows at all. They were shapes, thin and crouched, shifting just out of focus. My hand trembled as I reached for my flashlight. I turned it slowly, sweeping the beam across the corridor. Nothing. Just peeling paint, dusty carpet, abandoned office doors. I told myself it was fatigue, the long nights, my mind turning against me. But even as I reasoned, the sensation persisted. Someone or something was here. Just beyond the edges of my vision. Watching, waiting. I moved cautiously down the hall, flashlight cutting a narrow path. My own footsteps echoed too loudly, too sharply, bouncing off walls that seemed impossibly far apart. With each step, I felt the building stretch and warp, corridors elongating in ways they hadn't before. Doors I had passed 100 times before now seemed unfamiliar, their numbers wrong, their frames warped. I tried another exit, a side door near the storage room. Locked. I checked the keys in my pocket, fumbling. Nothing fit. I tried the stairwell on the fourth floor. Locked. My chest tightened, the whispers weaving around me in a rhythm I couldn't follow. Each exhale carried them closer, curling around my skull, pressing against my thoughts. I stopped, leaning against the wall, taking deep breaths. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, wavering shadows. And in one of them I saw movement, just a flicker, a shape that shouldn't exist. I spun, shining the flashlight, but the hallway was empty. The weight of being observed pressed harder. My stomach knotted. I considered calling someone, anyone, through the security radio, but the signal was dead. Only static returned, hissing softly in my ears. My own voice sounded strange when I muttered reassurances to myself. "It's fine. Just the building, you're fine." The words sounded hollow, barely convincing even to me. I walked further, trying to retrace my steps, desperate for familiarity. The office doors loomed like silent sentinels, each one closed and empty. Yet the sense of presence grew heavier. A shadow shifted along the wall, not consistent with the light. A whisper, soft, nearly inaudible, wound through the air. I froze, trying to locate it, to understand it. But comprehension eluded me. I reached the break room. The faint hum of the fluorescent light above made the silence almost tangible. I leaned against the counter, my flashlight sweeping over the dusty coffee machine, the old microwave, the stained sink. Everything was in its place. Or was it? I thought I saw a chair moved slightly, closer to the table than it had been before. I blinked. My mind wavered. Perhaps fatigue, perhaps imagination. I sat down for a moment, trying to steady myself. My pulse raced. The building was no longer just empty, it felt alive, observing, waiting. I rubbed my hands over my face and closed my eyes. When I opened them, I saw it. A figure, thin and indistinct, standing near the corner. Just a shape, featureless, almost like smoke curled into a vaguely human form. It flickered when I looked directly, disappearing like mist, only to reappear the moment I looked away. Panic threatened to take hold. I stood abruptly, moving toward the figure. My steps echoed unnaturally loud, bouncing in the corridor. The figure didn't move away, it didn't flee. It just watched, or so it seemed. A chill crept up my spine. My voice caught in my throat when I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. Only the quiet hiss of the fluorescent lights and the faint hum in the walls. I tried the stairwell door again. Locked. Again. And now the whispers were louder, curling around my head, layering over each other in a language I couldn't understand but somehow felt in my chest. My hands shook as I pounded on the metal door. "Hello," I shouted, my voice breaking the stillness, only to be swallowed immediately by the corridor. No one answered. There could be no one. Desperation set in. I moved down the hall, checking every door, every potential exit. Each one locked, each one impenetrable. The building had changed. It had grown, stretched, turned its familiar hallways into an endless maze. And through it all, the whispers wound tighter around me, teasing, suggesting, always just out of reach. I leaned against the wall, sliding down to the floor. My flashlight trembled in my hand. Shadows flickered on the walls, long and thin, like fingers reaching out. I could almost hear them breathe. The camera I had carried earlier recorded silently in my pocket, but even watching the feed didn't reassure me. Shapes flickered there that didn't exist in real space, silhouettes that twisted in impossible ways. Hours or maybe minutes passed. Time had lost its meaning. Each step, each heartbeat seemed to stretch into eternity. I thought about my life outside this building, the sun rising, the routine of the day shift, and I realized that I had no way back. The doors wouldn't open. The building wouldn't let me leave. And the presence in the shadows, it had no intention of allowing me relief. I whispered to myself, trying to stay sane, trying to anchor myself in reason. "It's a building, just a building, you're alone." But my own words sounded like lies. The weight of observation pressed on me, a constant, silent attention that I could not shake. My reflection in the small window of a closed office door caught my eye for a moment. Pale, drawn, eyes wide with disbelief. My own fear stared back, but there was something else behind it, something that didn't belong to me. I moved toward the emergency exit one more time, hopping, praying that the lock might have failed, that some mechanism had finally given way. But the door didn't budge. And then I heard it clearly. The whisper, right behind me this time, low, deliberate, curling around my ear. Not a word I could understand, but an intention. Malicious, patient, waiting. I spun, flashlight swinging, and the hallway stretched impossibly long. The walls seemed to bend, the floor slanting slightly under my feet. Shadows flickered in patterns that my mind tried and failed to follow. And through it all, the whispers grew, layering over each other, forming a rhythm, a chant, a heartbeat that I could feel in my chest. I sank to the floor again, gripping the flashlight, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The building had trapped me, not just physically but mentally. My mind tried to assert control, to reason, to anchor itself to reality. But the weight of presence, the impossible hallway, the flickering shadows, and the whispers, they were too strong. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed. Or maybe it didn't. My ears were ringing now, each whisper twisting in my skull. Time had no meaning. I was alone, and yet I was not. I had been watched, followed, and perhaps even chosen. The night stretched endlessly, the building alive in a way I could not explain, patient and deliberate. I closed my eyes, hugging my knees. Somewhere deep in the dark I could feel it, watching, waiting. And I knew with an impossible certainty that it would not stop, that the doors would not open, and that I would walk these halls forever. Not physically, perhaps, but in my mind, in my bones, in every shadow that flickered just beyond the edge of my vision. I had been searching for a new place for months. Cheap rent, quiet neighborhood, nothing fancy, just somewhere I could disappear for a while. When I finally found the small apartment on Willow Lane, I felt relief more than excitement. The building was old, the paint chipped, and the stairwell smelled faintly of damp wood and mildew. But it was mine, or at least it would be. The first night I unpacked slowly, taking my time to place each item where it felt right. The apartment was small, a single bedroom, a bathroom with a cracked tile, a tiny kitchen, and a living area just big enough for a couch and a desk. I left the lights low, only a single lamp casting a warm circle in the center of the room. The rest was shadows, corners that seemed to swallow themselves in darkness. It was cozy in a way, though the shadows seemed thicker than they should be. That's when I first noticed it, my neighbor's door across the hall. Apartment 2B, it was old wood, scuffed, the paint faded, and yet the door was always slightly open. I remember noticing it the moment I turned the key in my own lock. Just a crack, maybe 2 inches, but enough that I could see the dark interior. No lights, no furniture, just black. I assumed it was careless. Maybe a maintenance worker forgot to shut it properly, or maybe the old hinges made it swing open on its own. I didn't think much of it the first night. I told myself it was nothing. The next morning I went to make coffee. Sunlight filtered in through the narrow blinds, catching dust in the air. I glanced across the hall, and there it was again. The door slightly open. Same crack, same shadowed interior. My stomach twisted unexpectedly. I shook my head. It wasn't a big deal. Just a building, just a door, just nothing. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Every time I returned, every time I glanced across the hall, 2B was open. I asked the landlord once. 2B, nobody lives there, he said, his voice flat. It's been empty for years, just ignore it. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But walking past that door became impossible not to notice. Even when the hallway was bright with sunlight, it seemed darker. The crack in the door stretched like a shadowy mouth, whispering questions I didn't want to answer. One evening I came home late, exhausted. The building was quiet, the faint hum of the heating system the only sound. I carried my groceries in, trying to keep my mind elsewhere. And then I heard it. A sound from behind the slightly open door, just a soft creak, nothing more. I froze. My heart beat rapidly, hammering in my chest. I told myself it was the building settling. Old wood makes noise, just a draft, just imagination. I set the groceries down, trying to focus on anything else, anything normal. But the creak came again, softer this time, almost deliberate. I couldn't stop staring. The door hadn't moved, and yet I felt it. Something there just beyond the crack, watching, waiting. I swallowed hard, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe a cat, maybe nothing. Sleep came fitfully that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from the street outside made me jump. The apartment felt smaller, corners sharper, shadows deeper. And to be always to be slightly open, silent, patient. A week later, I decided to investigate. I told myself I wouldn't open the door, just a peek. I crept across the hall one night, my flashlight in hand, breathing shallow. The door didn't budge, but the crack was the same. A thin slice of darkness, a void just beyond my vision. I leaned closer, squinting. And then I thought I saw it, a flicker, like movement inside. A shadow shifting just beyond the frame of the door. I jerked back, heart pounding. My own pulse sounded deafening in the silent hall. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the movement of a curtain, the sway of a stray coat on a hanger. But it didn't feel like that. Not entirely. It felt deliberate, patient, waiting. The next morning I went about my routine, but the image of that flicker stayed in my mind. Every time I stepped into the hallway, I could almost see it there, lingering in the shadows of 2B. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking. I was alone. The building was empty. Nobody lived there. I began to notice little things. The faint smell of something metallic when I passed the door. A cold draft that seemed to seep from the crack, brushing against my ankles. Sometimes I thought I heard soft sounds, like whispers curling through the wood. I would pause, listening, straining to understand, but nothing solid ever formed. One evening I came home to find the door open wider than usual. A sliver of the floor inside was visible now. It wasn't enough to see furniture or anything recognizable, just blackness, but it felt alive. I felt my stomach twist with unease. I told myself to ignore it, to keep walking, to go into my apartment and shut the door behind me, but I couldn't. My feet stopped. My body stiffened. The whispers returned that night, so soft I could barely hear them, curling around my mind. Almost like someone speaking right behind my ear, but when I turned, no one was there. My apartment, my sanctuary, felt invaded by the presence across the hall. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing against the walls. The darkness outside 2B's door seemed to seep into my own space, stretching its influence across the hall. I tried to tell a friend about it once. "It's just an empty apartment," I said. "No one's there, it's fine." But my voice faltered. They laughed lightly. "Old buildings make noises. You're probably imagining it." But I wasn't imagining it. Not entirely. I had seen the flicker, felt the cold, heard the whispers curling in the hallway. Every time I passed the door, it seemed to watch me, patient, silent, waiting. I could feel it in my chest, a tightening that didn't ease even when I locked my own door behind me. Days passed and I began to adjust, forcing myself to act normal. Grocery runs, morning coffee, answering emails. But every step in the hallway made my stomach twist. The crack in the door was always there, the darkness always waiting, always patient. I would catch myself glancing at it from the kitchen, from the bedroom, from the bathroom mirror. The black void seemed to pulse, breathing softly. One night I decided to try something. I set my camera up in the hallway while I was asleep. Just a simple motion detecting camera meant to catch package deliveries. I told myself it would be silly, that it would prove nothing, but I wanted evidence. Anything. I woke to the sound of the camera clicking. I rushed to check it, half asleep, my heart thudding. The footage made my stomach drop. The door, the crack had widened, and inside, barely visible, something shifted. Not solid, not human, just a blur, a presence curling through the darkness. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The shape remained, patient, waiting, observing. I felt dizzy, disoriented. The apartment didn't feel safe anymore. Every corner, every shadow seemed to stretch toward the door across the hall. The presence wasn't confined to 2B. It seemed to reach into my own space, a silent pull toward that dark crack. Since then, I haven't left the apartment late at night unless I absolutely have to. I keep the lights on, curtains drawn, but it doesn't help. The crack remains, the presence waits, and the building seems alive, watching me, testing me. I don't know who or what once lived in 2B. I don't know if it's human or something else entirely. But I do know this. Every time I pass that door, every time I glance at the dark void, I feel it studying me. Patient, silent, and impossibly still. And I can't stop thinking about what might happen if it finally decides to step out. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. A faint odor, barely noticeable, curling through the apartment as I moved from the bedroom to the kitchen. I paused, sniffing the air, trying to place it. Metallic, musty, something between both. My first thought was old pipes or maybe the trash I hadn't taken out in a few days. But the smell didn't come from a source I could see. It wasn't strong in any one corner. It just existed, lingering in the corners of the air itself. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it. A side effect of too little sleep, too much coffee, my mind turning small annoyances into imagined horrors. But as I moved through the apartment that evening, it grew. Not in strength exactly, not enough to choke me, but in persistence. The smell wrapped around me like a faint, insistent presence, brushing my skin and making the hairs on my arms prickle. I glanced across the hall toward 2B. The door remained slightly open. That small crack had become a fixation. Every time I looked, I felt the pull of it, subtle and insistent, like a finger tapping lightly on the back of my mind. Tonight, the door seemed darker somehow, the shadows thicker, almost as if the darkness itself had density. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus. It's just an empty apartment, I told myself. Nothing more. Later, while washing dishes, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. Something fleeting, moving along the edge of the kitchen wall. I froze, heart tightening. My first instinct was to turn, flashlight, or in this case, the kitchen light, shining toward the motion. Nothing. Just the countertop, the sink, the dull reflection of the water. And yet I had seen it. I was certain. Something had passed, gliding across the floor or maybe hovering just above it. I tried to dismiss it. Fatigue. Shadows always shifting in old apartments, but the pattern continued. Each day, each evening, the odors persisted, changing subtly. Sweet at times, faintly burnt at others, metallic like blood or perhaps rust. I couldn't tell. My mind searched for explanations, cleaning products, old vents, a neighbor cooking late, but no source ever appeared. It existed as if it were part of the apartment itself, woven into the walls and floorboards. The shadows followed soon after, not regular shadows cast by light or furniture. These moved independently, flickering at the edge of my vision, stretching along the walls in impossible angles, detaching from any source. Sometimes they were small, just a smear on the wall. Sometimes they were taller than me, stretching toward the ceiling and disappearing before I could focus on them. I tried to record them. My phone camera, a small handheld recorder, anything. But every time I checked, the shadows vanished in the footage. I could see the apartment exactly as it was, empty and silent. Only I had seen them. Only I had smelled the odors. And yet I could feel the apartment's pulse, the subtle shifting of presence around me. One night I decided to confront it, whatever it was. I walked across the apartment slowly, flashlight low, my steps deliberate. The smell grew stronger, curling around me, almost teasing me. The shadows flickered at the edge of the light, small shapes stretching and twisting. I stopped, exhaling slowly, and whispered, "Who's there?" No answer, just the apartment breathing quietly, waiting. I tried to follow the largest shadow. It seemed to move independently, drifting along the hallway walls, stretching along the ceiling, disappearing at the corners. Every step I took to approach it felt sluggish, as if the apartment itself resisted me. My pulse raced, hands shaking slightly, and the air grew colder. The odor intensified, metallic, sweet, and faintly acrid all at once. I gagged slightly, leaning against the wall. I wondered if I had gone insane. If the stress of moving, the loneliness of a cheap apartment had finally tipped me over. But the shadows didn't feel like hallucinations. They had weight. They had intention. Even when I turned to look directly, they vanished only to reappear moments later in another corner, moving independently, ignoring the rules of light and physics. Sleep became impossible. Each night the odors and shadows grew stronger. I would lie awake, flashlight on the nightstand, listening. The apartment felt alive, whispering, moving, waiting. And always from the corner of my vision the shadows twisted, stretching toward me, then retreating just beyond perception. One evening I tried to occupy myself. I made tea, washed dishes, folded laundry. The shadows still moved, tiny flickers along the walls, in the corners of mirrors, along the edges of furniture. I caught a movement near the kitchen window, a smear of darkness, tall and thin. I spun, shining the flashlight. Nothing. Only my own reflection in the glass. But the smell lingered, curling along my skin, pressing into my chest, making me feel like I couldn't breathe. I began leaving doors open in my own apartment, hoping it would give the presence somewhere to exist without encroaching on me. The bedroom door, the closet, even the bathroom. But the shadows ignored them, drifting instead along the hallway, always outside, always at the edge of perception. The smell followed, curling and twisting, sometimes rising from the floor, sometimes from the walls, impossible to pinpoint. I started keeping a journal, documenting the shadows and the odors. Time blurred, days and nights merged. I couldn't tell if the building was always like this or if it had awakened when I moved in. The crack in 2B remained a fixation, a constant. The darkness inside seemed to pulse in rhythm with my own heartbeat, a silent invitation or a warning. I began to dream of it. Shadows flickering in the corners, curling around my body as I lay asleep, odors pressing against my nose, cold and metallic. One night I woke to a sound I couldn't place. Soft scraping, faint and deliberate like nails along wood. My flashlight beam swept the apartment, but nothing moved. The shadows had disappeared, or perhaps had only hidden, curling in corners or inside walls. The odor was sharp now, metallic, acrid, almost unbearable. I gagged, coughing, my stomach twisting. And then from the hallway I saw it. A shadow, taller than the doorframe, stretching impossibly upward, moving slowly toward me. No features, no form, just darkness in motion. I froze, unable to move. The air grew colder still, wrapping around my skin, pressing into my chest, making it hard to breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, to flee, but my legs were leaden. It moved with intention, not chaotic, not random, deliberate, patient. The longer I stared, the more I felt that it was aware of me, observing, learning, testing. I wanted to cry out, to shake myself free, but my voice refused to cooperate. The smell intensified, curling along my nostrils, metallic, sweet, impossible to identify. And then, as abruptly as it appeared, the shadow retreated. Not vanished, retreated. A slow, deliberate withdrawal back into the corners, the walls, the edges of perception. I collapsed onto the couch, hands trembling, heart racing. The odor remained, faint now, like a lingering memory of its presence, teasing me with its persistence. I knew I couldn't stay, not like this. The apartment had become a trap, a space alive with something unseen, something patient and deliberate. Each shadow, each smell, each flicker in the corner of my vision reminded me that I was not alone. And the door across the hall, 2B, remained a silent sentinel, the crack in its frame a gateway. A doorway I couldn't understand, but that I knew led somewhere dangerous, something waiting. Sleep did not return that night, or any night after. The shadows and odors continued, shifting, curling, testing the boundaries of my awareness. I could not ignore them. I could not escape them. And I began to understand, in a way that was more than instinct, more than fear, that they were waiting. Not for me to leave, not for me to see, but for me to notice, to acknowledge their presence, their patient persistence. I stayed awake the next day, moving slowly, carefully, avoiding the hallway whenever possible. The shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, the odors drifting along the floor and walls, curling in impossible directions. I realized with a sinking certainty that the apartment itself was no longer a safe space. The presence had claimed it, and I had entered too late, too unaware, too fragile to resist. And in that realization, a small, persistent dread settled in my chest. The shadows moved freely now, independent of light, independent of reason, curling along the edges of walls and doors, brushing against me in ways I could not see but could feel. The smells pressed deeper, weaving through my senses, making sleep, peace, and escape impossible. The apartment was alive, and I was trapped within its awareness, waiting, always aware, always watched. It was quiet that night, quieter than usual. Even the distant hum of traffic seemed to fade into the background, leaving my apartment cloaked in a heavy, unnatural silence. I had spent the evening trying to keep myself busy, folding laundry, cleaning dishes, rearranging the small living room. But the moment darkness fully settled, when the city lights outside dimmed and the apartment's own shadows stretched, I felt it again. A whisper, soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the hum of the air conditioner curling through the kitchen and into the hall. I froze mid-step, chest tightening. My mind immediately searched for a rational explanation. Could it be a neighbor, the building's old wiring, the pipes always groaning in strange ways? But the whisper was too deliberate, too close. And then I heard it clearly, unmistakable this time. My name. I spun around, heart hammering. My apartment was empty. I was alone. I told myself it was fatigue, the endless days of unpacking, the stress of the move playing tricks on me. But the sound persisted, curling softly through the air, curling toward me, insistent and patient. I took a slow step forward, flashlight in hand, though I didn't really need it. The apartment was illuminated by a single lamp, casting long shadows across the corners. The whisper repeated, clearer now. My name. Not shouted, not urgent, just spoken, with the slow, careful cadence of someone trying to coax me somewhere. Please come. I froze, gripping the flashlight, feeling my pulse race. The shadows along the walls seemed to flicker, stretching and twisting independently of the light. I told myself to breathe, to ground myself, to ignore it, but I couldn't. Every instinct screamed that someone or something was in my apartment, watching, waiting. I moved cautiously down the hallway, flashlight sweeping in slow arcs. Each step seemed to echo unnaturally, bouncing off the walls, magnifying the emptiness. The whispers followed, drifting from room to room, circling me. Here, come see, they murmured, soft and deliberate, curling around my mind, teasing, coaxing. I checked every corner, every closet, every possible hiding place. Nothing. Only the apartment, quiet and still. And yet the whispers persisted, echoing softly as if the walls themselves were speaking. I began to wonder if the sounds were coming from 2B across the hall. The door remained slightly open, the darkness inside pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat I could almost feel. I stepped closer, drawn despite every rational thought screaming at me to stop. The odor I had noticed before had returned, faint but undeniable. Metallic, sweet, acrid. It curled through the hall, brushing against my skin, tugging at my chest. And the whispers grew stronger, threading through the air like smoke, almost tangible in their persistence. Come see me. My knees wobbled. I wanted to run, to slam my door, to escape the presence pressing against me. But my body moved slowly, hypnotized, compelled by something I couldn't see but felt with every nerve. The darkness of 2B's crack seemed to deepen, thicker than any shadow should be, swallowing the light from my flashlight, pulsing subtly. I leaned closer, hand trembling, pressing my ear toward the open crack. The whispers intensified, layering over one another, forming a rhythm, a cadence that pressed into my chest, into my skull. It wasn't a voice exactly, not a human voice, but it carried meaning, intent, a pull I couldn't resist. Come. The words felt alive, not spoken by lips, but projected directly into my awareness, curling into my thoughts, pressing into my memories, tugging at the edges of my sanity. I stumbled backward, gripping the wall, breathing heavily, trying to push the thoughts away. My apartment felt impossibly small now, corners stretching, shadows deepening, every surface alive with subtle movement I couldn't define. I tried to turn away, to retreat into my own room, but the whispers followed, drifting along the walls, curling around the edges of doors, brushing against my skin as I moved. I felt eyes on me, though I could see nothing. And then I realized the shadows were moving differently tonight. No longer just flickers at the edge of vision. They had purpose, converging slowly along the hallway, stretching toward me in ways my mind shouldn't have been able to process. I slammed my bedroom door, hoping it would contain the presence, and sank to the floor, flashlight clutched to my chest. The whispers didn't stop. They pressed against the door, pressed into my head, soft, deliberate, impossible to ignore. "We see you, we know you, come." I covered my ears, but the sound seemed to exist inside my skull, vibrating in rhythm with my own heartbeat. The room felt alive, the walls breathing, the shadows curling closer, pressing against the edges of the door. I couldn't see them, but I could feel the pressure, the pull, the inevitability of their attention. Time lost all meaning. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours. I counted each breath, each heartbeat, trying to anchor myself. The whispers ebbed slightly, then surged, always patient, always insistent, carrying meaning I couldn't decipher fully but understood instinctively. Someone or something was here in my apartment, unseen, coaxing me, testing me, waiting. Eventually, the whispers grew fainter, retreating just beyond perception, but the sensation remained. A presence, patient and deliberate, lingering in the corners, brushing along the floor, curling around the walls. I lay on the bed, flashlight off now, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to move, too aware that any movement might provoke them. Sleep came in fragments, shallow, haunted. Dreams filled with shifting shadows and whispers curling around my head, pulling me toward the darkness across the hall. Each time I awoke, my body ached, heart racing, the odor still faintly lingering, subtle and acrid, as if the apartment itself exhaled it for me to breathe. I tried to rationalize. Exhaustion, stress, imagination. The building's age, the thin walls, my own fear. But the whispers were deliberate. They were patient. And I could feel them learning me, understanding my habits, coaxing me ever closer to the darkness of 2B. Days passed and I became hyper-aware. Every sound, every creak, every flicker of shadow set my nerves on edge. The whispers came at unexpected moments, softly from the kitchen while I cooked, curling around my desk while I worked, brushing the corners of my eyes while I read. Sometimes I would hear my own name, spoken so softly I had to strain to recognize it. Always inviting, always patient. I began leaving lights on in the apartment, the smallest illumination enough to reduce the shadows to mere patterns along the walls. But it didn't help. The darkness had a persistence beyond light, slipping past it, curling in corners, brushing the floor. The whispers never stopped, always present, always patient. One night, driven by a combination of fear and curiosity, I approached the crack in 2B's door again. The whispering intensified as I neared, curling into my mind like smoke, pressing against my thoughts. The odor grew stronger, metallic, acrid, pressing into my chest. My hand shook as I reached toward the door, fingertips brushing the edge. I wanted to open it. I wanted to confront whatever waited behind that small gap in the door. But instinct screamed at me to stop, to retreat, to run. My mind raced. What could possibly live in a vacant apartment? What could wait, patient and deliberate, unseen, calling my name from across the hall? I stepped back, collapsing against the wall. The whispers softened slightly, almost like a sigh of patience. The shadows along the hallway walls twitched and shifted, always out of direct view, always just beyond the flashlight's beam. I could feel their attention, their watchfulness, the deliberate awareness that filled every corner of the apartment. I retreated to my bedroom and locked the door, though I knew locks could not truly contain it. The whispers curled along the walls, brushing against the door, curling into my ears, reminding me that the presence was patient, waiting, watching, and I knew with a sinking certainty that this was only the beginning. Sleep came in short, haunted bursts. Each awakening was a confrontation with the darkness and its patient whispers, the odors curling through the air, the shadows flickering just beyond perception. Every moment in my apartment became a negotiation with the unseen, a slow, subtle dance with something deliberate and intelligent, something alive in ways I could not define. And each time I looked at 2B, at that small, dark crack, I felt the pull again. Patient, deliberate, impossible to resist. It was waiting, always waiting, and I knew deep down that one day it would step beyond the crack, and I would be ready or not. The next morning, I couldn't ignore it anymore. My sleep had been fractured by whispers, shadows, and the persistent, metallic odor that seemed to seep from 2B's crack. I felt hollow, like my energy had been drained in the night by something I could neither see nor understand. I knew I had to do something. I had to prove that I wasn't imagining it. I called the landlord again, voice tight, hands trembling slightly. There's something wrong with 2B, I said, my words stumbled. I've been hearing voices, seeing shadows. There's an odor, I think someone in the apartment. There was a pause on the other end, longer than it should have been. 2B, he finally said, flat, like he had said the words too many times before. Look, I've told you before that apartment been empty for decades. Nobody lived there for 20 years, maybe more. Just leave it alone. I laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It came out hollow, tinged with the panic I was trying to suppress. Decades? That's impossible. I see the door, I hear things, I feel it. You're telling me it's empty. Yes, he said, his voice colder now, clipped. Empty. And if you're hearing things, maybe you need help. I mean professionally. I ended the call, hands shaking, heart racing. Empty? How could it be empty? I had seen the crack. I had smelled the odors. I had felt the pull, the presence, the shadows curling along the walls. I had experienced it. And now suddenly the building itself, the landlord, the official record, claimed it didn't exist. I didn't know what to believe. My own memory, my senses, my sanity, everything suddenly felt fragile, like glass that could shatter with a single step. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run, to never return. But I couldn't. Not yet. Something kept me here, tethered to the apartment, to the whispering shadows and the persistent odor. I went to the local authorities, filing a report. A missing person, maybe. Something strange in the building, an intruder. I explained it carefully, trying to keep my voice level, trying not to let fear color my words too much. They listened politely, took notes, eyebrows raised occasionally, and then they said the words that broke me in half. There's no record of anyone living in that apartment for decades. The building plans show it's been sealed off. We can send someone to check, but we're concerned about your mental state. Are you feeling okay? I wanted to scream. I'm not crazy. I'm not imagining it. But their words pressed down on me, a weight of authority and disbelief. The officer's gaze was gentle but unyielding, and I felt myself shrinking under it, like a child caught in a room too large and too silent. I returned to the apartment, unsure if I should lock myself in or stay away. The building was quiet, too quiet. 2B's door was gone, not just the crack, gone entirely. I stood in the hallway, hands gripping the railing, eyes scanning the space. Nothing, just a blank wall where the door had been. The whispering returned that night, though softer now, almost mocking. I could hear the words curling at the edge of my mind. You saw it. You felt it. You know it's there. I tried to sleep, but my mind refused to obey. The room felt smaller, corners sharper, the shadows pressing inward, curling along the walls, always just beyond the edge of the lamp's light. I could still smell it, faint, metallic, acrid, and feel the pull from 2B's location, now an empty, blank space. Days passed. I avoided the hallway, avoided the sight of the disappeared door. Friends noticed my withdrawn behavior, my distracted manner. Some whispered behind my back that I was losing it. Others offered help, but I refused. What could anyone do? Explain the unexplainable. Convince someone of what can't be measured, can't be recorded, can't be proven. I began to question myself, my memories, my sanity. Had I really moved in? Had I really smelled the odors, seen the shadows? I felt like a ghost in my own life, drifting between what was real and what was imagined. And yet the fear, the persistent weight of something unseen, told me that it had all been real. Some part of me still knew. I returned to the apartment one afternoon, unable to resist the pull. I paced the hallway, hands brushing the blank wall where 2B's door should have been. My mind spun with questions I could not answer. And then, as if the building itself were responding to my presence, I heard it again. A whisper, soft, deliberate, curling through the walls. "We remember you." My heart stuttered. I swallowed hard. I wanted to run, to escape, to flee the apartment for good, but I couldn't. The whispers wrapped around me, pressing into my chest, tugging at my mind. Shadows flickered at the edges of vision, twisting in ways the light should not allow. The odor returned, subtle but insistent, curling along the floorboards. It was then I realized that 2B had never truly been just an apartment. It was a presence, a consciousness, a patient, deliberate entity that had waited for someone to notice it, someone to interact, someone to give it focus. And I had done exactly that. I tried to leave, but the hallways seemed to shift. Walls stretched subtly, corners deepened, and shadows flickered along the edges. My own apartment felt invaded, no longer safe, no longer private. Even inside my own bedroom, I could feel the presence waiting, watching, patient. I tried therapy, counseling, even medication. Nothing worked. Sleep was fractured. The whispers returned nightly, curling around me, tugging at my thoughts. The shadows flickered in the corners, moving independently of the light. The metallic odor pressed into my nostrils, insistent, omnipresent. I began to fear my own perception. Could I trust what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled? Or had the apartment, the building, or whatever waited behind 2B already begun to warp my mind? I stopped talking to friends. I avoided the hallway. I avoided thinking about it, but the whispers didn't stop. They didn't need doors, walls, or windows. They existed, patient and deliberate, beyond human comprehension. And I realized with cold certainty that it didn't matter if 2B was real or imagined. The effect it had on me was real. My fear, my sleepless nights, the shadows and odors, they were real. And they would continue, patient and deliberate, until I succumbed entirely to the pull. I tried documenting everything. Journal entries, photographs, voice recordings, but nothing captured it fully. The shadows vanished on film. The odors left no trace. The whispers were impossible to record in a way that conveyed their persistent, coaxing presence. I was alone in knowing, alone in experiencing, and alone in fearing the inevitable. And the building seemed to respond. Each time I tried to rationalize, tried to convince myself I was imagining it, the whispering intensified. Shadows flickered more aggressively, corners deepened, and the odor pressed harder into my senses. The apartment was alive in ways I could not understand, and it had claimed me as its witness, its focus, its prey. I thought about leaving, packing everything and disappearing. But the thought of stepping into the hallway, facing the empty space where 2B's door once was, and knowing that whatever had been there was still present, waiting, made my body freeze. I couldn't move. I couldn't act. I could only exist, trapped between fear and rationality, between the seen and the unseen. At night I lie awake, listening to the whispers curling at the edge of perception. They are patient, deliberate, coaxing. They call my name softly, over and over, as if the building itself were breathing them into the air. Shadows flicker at the corners, twisting in impossible ways. The metallic odor coils through the apartment, pressing into my chest, making sleep impossible, making peace impossible. I know the truth now. It doesn't matter that the authorities say 2B has been empty for decades. It doesn't matter if I am considered unreliable, delusional, insane. The presence is real, patient, watching, waiting, and one day it will move beyond the empty space. One day it will step fully into my awareness, and I will have to confront it, or it will confront me. Until then, I remain here, trapped in a quiet, creeping horror between disbelief and certainty, between fear and fascination. The apartment is alive, patient, and deliberate. And I am alone, its sole witness, its unwilling participant, existing in a space where reality bends, and the line between sanity and the unseen is forever blurred. It was one of those nights where the world feels thinner, stretched out and silent, as if the usual sounds of civilization had been muted. The hum of my car engine was the only companion, steady and predictable, while the headlights cut a narrow path through the darkness. I had taken this detour on a whim, looking for a shortcut, but as I drove further, I realized the road itself seemed older than it should be, almost forgotten by time. The highway was narrow, 2 lanes barely wide enough for modern vehicles, and the paint on the asphalt had faded into ghostly white lines, cracked and peeling. Signs leaned crookedly, their paint flacking, symbols half erased by years of sun and neglect. Some pointed to towns I had never heard of, or in directions that made no sense at all. Others had no words at all, just blank rectangles, staring at me in silence as I passed. I shrugged off the unease, blaming fatigue, the late hour, the monotony of driving alone. Still, a small, persistent feeling pressed at the back of my mind, that I was not supposed to be here, that something about this road was wrong. Abandoned vehicles began to appear at intervals along the shoulder. At first, it was 1 or 2 old sedans and trucks rusting quietly in the moonlight. They were strange in their arrangement, parked neatly as though someone had stepped out for a moment and never returned. No debris, no tire marks, nothing to suggest an accident. Just cars frozen in place, waiting. I slowed the car instinctively, scanning each one. Windows cracked, interiors decayed. Some still had items inside, coffee cups, old newspapers, a child's toy left forgotten on a backseat. I tried to imagine the stories behind them, the people who had once driven these vehicles. It should have felt ordinary, mundane even, but the quiet, the way the cars seemed positioned deliberately along the road, made my skin prickle. The road curved sharply, and in the distance I saw another sign. It leaned heavily to one side, obscured by weeds. I squinted through the headlights, trying to make out what it said. Only the edges of letters were visible. Welcome, nowhere. Or maybe I imagined the word. Perhaps it was my mind playing tricks, trying to find meaning in decay. A sense of unease settled into my chest. I debated turning back, retracing the stretch I had already driven. But the road behind me seemed different somehow, darker, narrower. The headlights no longer illuminated the lines clearly. I pressed on, slow and deliberate, listening to the soft hum of the engine, to the tires whispering across the asphalt. Every so often, a car would appear closer than it should be, as if I hadn't noticed it before. Sometimes it was an old sedan with shattered windows, sometimes a rusted pickup leaning at an impossible angle. I tried to reason it out. Perhaps I had just missed it earlier, or the shadows played tricks on my eyes. But something about the arrangement, the spacing, the quiet intent in their placement, felt deliberate. The air grew colder as I drove. The night pressed in around the car, thick and suffocating. Fog began to form, curling along the road, soft and gray, clinging to the asphalt like a living thing. The beams of my headlights cut through it in narrow, wavering shafts, illuminating the abandoned vehicles in brief glimpses. Their interiors were empty, yet I felt eyes on me, unblinking, silent. I thought about stopping, turning the car off, stepping out. But the fog made it impossible to see very far ahead, and the idea of walking into that uncertainty made my skin crawl. Something about the night itself seemed aware, deliberate. The silence pressed against me, heavier than the weight of the car, heavier than my own heartbeat. I noticed a particular truck up ahead. Its hood was crumpled, paint faded, tires half buried in dirt and leaves. What made it different was a faint light inside, the glow of a dashboard or a cell phone screen perhaps. I slowed, heart tightening, trying to make sense of it. But the glow wasn't consistent. It flickered, dimming and brightening in irregular pulses, almost like it was breathing. I couldn't see anyone inside. The windows were opaque with dust and grime. I considered driving past quickly, forcing myself to remain rational. Maybe the light was a reflection, a trick of the fog, a remnant from some long-forgotten device left behind. Still, I felt drawn to it, compelled in a way that didn't make sense. As I approached, I noticed something on the pavement ahead. Footprints or tire tracks. They were faint, irregular, and disappeared under the fog. I slowed even further, eyes straining, flashlight beam of the car scanning the ground. There was nothing else. No movement, no sound beyond the engine and the soft hiss of tires on wet asphalt. And yet the feeling persisted of being watched, followed, coaxed forward by something unseen. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the road. Focus on driving. Focus on making it out of this stretch of highway before dawn. But the abandoned vehicles continued to appear, spaced along the shoulder as I drove. Each one was a mirror of the others, yet subtly different, doors slightly open, cracked windows, interiors filled with objects I didn't recognize but felt familiar, as if they belonged to another life I had forgotten. A sign loomed ahead, larger this time. It was mounted higher, leaning dangerously toward the road. I slowed to a crawl. The words were visible now, stark against the peeling paint. "You should not be here." I laughed nervously. A joke, surely. Some prank by locals, perhaps. But the letters had a strange depth, as if they were carved rather than painted, as if they had existed longer than I had known. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. I could feel the fog thickening, curling along the windshield and sides of the car, pressing against the metal like cold fingers. I wanted to turn back, to run, but the road behind me had shifted. The abandoned cars seemed closer, more numerous, lining the edges of the asphalt in a pattern I hadn't noticed before. I tried to reverse, but the tires slipped slightly on wet patches. The fog thickened, curling into the cabin, seeping through the small gaps in the door. The light of my headlights seemed swallowed by it, reducing the road to a narrow, wavering path that disappeared into gray nothingness. And then I heard it, faint at first, almost beneath the hum of the engine, a sound that didn't belong, footsteps. No, too soft, deliberate, something moving behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, eyes straining, fog curling around the edges. Nothing. Only the reflection of my own pale face, wide-eyed, hands gripping the wheel. The footsteps came again, echoing softly, perfectly timed with my heartbeat. I forced myself to look, to remain calm, to rationalize. Maybe someone was walking along the road. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was my own mind, straining in isolation, conjuring sounds to match the fear coiling in my chest. I pressed forward, slow and deliberate, ears straining. The fog shifted with me, curling, stretching, thickening, as if it were alive, breathing in response to my presence. The vehicles along the shoulder seemed to shift too, subtle movements just out of the corner of my eye. I blinked. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the sense that each car, each sign, each shadow of fog was deliberate, waiting, patient. I passed a sedan that seemed different. It was facing me this time, headlights long dead, interior dark, but the silhouette of a figure sitting in the driver's seat was unmistakable. I slammed on the brakes, heart hammering. My eyes darted, flashlight of the car sweeping over the figure. Empty. Nothing. Only the seat, worn and cracked as though no one had ever been there. And yet the sense of being observed pressed against me, a weight in the air. I accelerated again, hands trembling, knuckles white. The fog seemed to recede slightly as I moved, but the road remained impossible, twisting, endless. Signs now lined the highway in every direction, pointing nowhere. Words half-erased, symbols I couldn't recognize, arrows curving in impossible angles. Each one seemed to whisper, soft and insistent. Go further, see more, do not turn back. The feeling of being followed intensified. I could feel the presence, patient and deliberate, moving along the edges of the road, along the abandoned vehicles, curling with the fog. Every heartbeat felt amplified, every breath stolen by tension, the dark pressing closer with each passing second. I realized I had been driving for longer than I intended. Hours, maybe, minutes. Time no longer mattered. The road had become a corridor of unease, lined with abandoned vehicles and cryptic signs, fog curling like smoke, carrying faint, metallic odors that pressed against my senses. And then, as I turned a sharp bend, the world shifted. The road seemed to stretch, elongate impossibly. The vehicles were gone, the signs blank, the fog thinned, for a moment relief. But the sense of being watched didn't fade. Something was out there, patient, deliberate, waiting for me to see it, to acknowledge it. I knew then that I couldn't turn back, that the detour I had taken on a whim had led me somewhere outside the rules of normal roads, normal nights, normal perception. And as the tires whispered against the asphalt, as the fog curled softly around the car, I realized I was not alone. Something waited, patient, deliberate, unseen. and I had invited it by continuing to drive. The night had thickened by the time I noticed the streetlights. They weren't simply old or malfunctioning. They flickered with a rhythm that felt deliberate, like a heartbeat. One second they glowed dim and weak. The next they would brighten harshly, illuminating the highway in fractured pulses. Each flicker cast the abandoned vehicles in jagged shadows, stretching and twisting in ways my mind shouldn't have been able to process. I tried to tell myself it was just fatigue. The long drive, the monotony of the asphalt beneath me, the isolation, it was all playing tricks, but the sensation didn't fade. The highway felt wrong, too quiet, too empty, and then I noticed the car behind me. At first, it was just a shape in the rearview mirror, distant, small, but unmistakable, a sedan following at a consistent pace. My stomach tightened. I glanced back slowly, careful not to jerk the wheel, and when I did, it was gone. No tail lights, no headlights, nothing. The road behind me stretched empty, the fog curling lazily in the beams of my headlights. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, convinced I had imagined it. But seconds later, the shape returned. Same distance behind me. Same movement, same precision. It followed every turn, every curve, every acceleration. Yet each time I looked, it vanished. There was no sound, no reflection, just the faint impression of a presence that refused to be fully seen. I pressed harder on the accelerator, though the speed felt meaningless. The car matched me, always patient, always silent. I tried varying my route, swerving slightly, hugging the edge of the road. The fog seemed to thicken around the rearview mirror, masking the car, only for it to reappear moments later, perfectly aligned. Then the streetlights began to change the landscape. Objects that hadn't been there before appeared at intervals along the shoulder. A rusted bicycle leaning against a guardrail. A broken chair, its legs twisted unnaturally. A stroller, empty but positioned like someone had set it down carefully. None of these items made sense. They were too well placed, as though someone, or something, had arranged them with intention. I slowed the car to a crawl, heart hammering. Each new object I passed seemed to stare at me in the dim, flickering light. The stroller wheels trembled slightly as I drove past. The chair leaned closer to the road than I thought possible. And the bicycle, its front wheels spun slowly, back and forth, though no wind disturbed it. My mind tried to rationalize it. Old debris from the road, wind patterns, vibrations from passing cars that I hadn't noticed. But the highway was deserted. No wind, no vehicles, no explanation. Only the objects and the persistent, flickering streetlights and the vanishing car behind me. I realized then that the road itself was no longer predictable. Corners appeared where there shouldn't have been corners. Guardrails ended abruptly, replaced by black voids of asphalt and fog. Signs became increasingly indecipherable, symbols I didn't recognize, arrows pointing in impossible directions, words half erased, dangling on the edge of meaning. The car behind me didn't blink. It didn't hesitate. It simply followed, patient and deliberate, as though it were guiding me somewhere I didn't want to go, along a highway that no longer seemed bound by ordinary geography. I passed a small gas station, or at least I thought it was one. Its windows were dark, the pumps rusted beyond recognition. A faint flicker of light came from inside, almost imperceptible, as if someone was moving in the shadows. I considered stopping, stepping out, confronting whatever or whoever was there. But instinct screamed at me to keep moving. I pressed onward, watching the road, scanning the roadside. The objects multiplied. A playground swing, empty, rocking slowly despite the stillness of the night. A mailbox, upright, pristine, as if freshly painted. And between these objects, the fog thickened, curling in patterns that suggested movement, almost human. The car behind me remained silent. I tried not to focus on it, tried not to acknowledge its persistence. But my mind fixated. It was always there, always patient, always waiting. It seemed to leer at me, a silent predator following my every choice, my every move. And each time I looked, it vanished, leaving only the highway stretching endlessly behind me. I wanted to escape, to leave the highway, to find the familiar roads that should have been ahead. But the landscape refused me. Every turn led to more objects, more flickering lights, more fog that pressed against the edges of my vision. I began to feel a weight pressing down on the car, on my shoulders, on my chest. The night itself seemed aware, responsive, deliberate. I noticed shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. Not the elongated shadows cast by the flickering streetlights, but separate, independent. They stretched from the roadside objects, curling toward the highway, brushing the asphalt in ways that shouldn't have been possible. My pulse raced. I wanted to believe it was fatigue, hallucination, imagination. But the sensation of being observed was undeniable, persistent, relentless. I tried to focus on the road, count the streetlights, mark the distance, measure the objects, rationalize, ground myself in something tangible. But the more I tried, the more surreal it became. One moment, an abandoned sedan rested quietly along the shoulder. The next, it had rotated slightly, door ajar, though I hadn't moved. The shadows shifted accordingly, curling along the ground in patterns that mocked gravity, logic, and reason. The whispers began next, faint at first, just beneath the hum of the engine. I thought it might be the tires on wet asphalt, the wind through a cracked window. But they coalesced slowly, curling around my mind, soft, deliberate. Keep driving, follow. Look, do not stop. I clenched the steering wheel. I tried to resist. I tried to ignore the suggestions curling at the edge of thought. But the highway itself seemed alive, guiding me forward, patient and deliberate. And the car behind me remained, always there, just at the edge of perception, its presence undeniable even as it vanished whenever I dared glance back. I passed a cluster of objects, chairs, strollers, a small bookshelf, each item arranged with impossible precision. The fog thickened, curling around the items, blurring their edges. I realized I could no longer discern what was real and what was something else. The headlights reflected off the objects in strange ways, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and move independently. And then I saw the figure. It was standing at the edge of the fog, just beyond the objects, silent still. At first I thought it was a man, but the outline was wrong. Elongated limbs, shoulders that twisted unnaturally, head cocked in a way that seemed impossible. It didn't move, but I felt it watching, waiting, patient. The whispers intensified, curling around my mind like smoke. Drive, see, follow. I wanted to swerve, to escape, to run off the highway. But the road ahead was gone, swallowed by fog, darkness, and the patient arrangement of objects. My pulse thundered in my ears. I gripped the wheel so tightly I could feel the bones in my hands. The car behind me had returned, suddenly, impossibly close. Its headlights gleamed through the fog, but the car itself seemed distorted, stretched, as if it weren't entirely real. I blinked and it vanished again, leaving only the empty road behind. But I could feel its presence, patient and deliberate, pressing into the night, following my every choice. I pressed forward, slow and deliberate. The objects multiplied. The shadows grew longer, curling along the asphalt, brushing against the tires, whispering in patterns I couldn't ignore. And still the car followed, patient, silent, watching, waiting. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed. Time became meaningless. The highway stretched endlessly, lined with objects that shouldn't exist, lit by streetlights flickering in impossible rhythms. The fog pressed closer. The whispers coiled around my thoughts. The presence behind me, patient and deliberate, never wavered. I realized then that I was trapped. Not physically, but in the perception of this highway, in the rhythm of flickering lights, in the patient observation of something I couldn't see. Every instinct screamed to stop, to escape, to close my eyes and wait for the night to pass. But I knew I couldn't. The objects, the shadows, the vanishing car, they required acknowledgement, interaction, attention. And I couldn't resist. I drove on, slow, deliberate, heart-hammering, senses straining. The night was alive, patient, deliberate, and I had entered its rhythm, its pattern, its domain. There was no turning back. There was only the highway, the flickering lights, the objects, the fog, and the unseen presence following, waiting, patient beyond comprehension. I tried to exit. I really did. The thought of escaping the flickering lights, the abandoned vehicles, the fog pressing in like a living thing, consumed me. My hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles pale, as I searched for an off-ramp, a familiar turn, anything that could take me away from this stretch of highway that had grown impossibly long. But every turn I took brought me back to the same stretch of road, the same abandoned cars, the same flickering streetlights. The objects along the roadside, chairs, strollers, bicycles, were arranged exactly as I had seen them before. I stopped, braked hard, and looked behind me. Nothing. Fog, shadows, and the faint, patient presence that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I tried the exit again, forcing myself to remain calm, rational. I traced the signs with my eyes, hoping to recognize a familiar symbol, a town I had passed before. But each time the signs seemed to shift. Words erased themselves, symbols twisted into shapes I didn't recognize, arrows bending in impossible directions. It was as if the highway itself was alive, aware of my attempts to leave, bending around me, holding me in place. The fog thickened with each failed attempt. It pressed against the car, curling along the edges of the tires, seeping through the small gaps in the doors. I could barely see a few feet ahead, and the objects along the shoulder seemed closer now, almost reaching toward the car. The stroller rocked gently, the chair leaned impossibly, and the bicycle's wheel spun as if on a hidden axle, though there was no wind. My pulse pounded in my ears. I tried to remind myself it was just a highway, a road, asphalt and paint and signs. But reason felt fragile, brittle, incapable of holding me against what I was experiencing. Something about the night was deliberate, patient, observing my every movement, my every thought. The car behind me, still invisible when I looked, still present when I dared not, was a constant reminder that I was not alone. I forced my eyes back on the road. The fog shifted, curling in slow spirals that seemed almost intentional, like smoke in a calm room directed by unseen hands. I noticed a figure standing ahead, far along the shoulder. At first I thought it was a pedestrian, lost like me, perhaps stranded. But the shape didn't move naturally. It stood too still, limbs elongated and awkward, head tilted at a strange angle. Shadows clung to it, deep and impossible, stretching across the asphalt and fog like it was anchored to the night itself. I blinked, it was gone. I forced myself to keep driving. Each mile, or what I believed were miles, blended into the next. Time stretched unnaturally. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. My thoughts grew sluggish, edges blurred, like my mind itself was dissolving into the fog. I wasn't just driving through the night anymore. I was driving through a space where time and distance had no meaning, where the laws of reality bent to the rhythm of something unseen. The streetlights flickered again with that soft, uneven heartbeat. I counted them obsessively at first, trying to measure the distance to ground myself, but counting became impossible. Their spacing was inconsistent. Sometimes they seemed closer, sometimes farther away, their flicker synchronizing with the beat of my own racing heart. I tried the exit one more time, turned the wheel sharply, followed the ramp, the sign, the arrow, and once again I was back, the same stretch, the same objects, the same impossibly patient road. I screamed into the night, the sound swallowed instantly by the fog. The highway offered no answer, no escape, only the continuation of its endless, looping rhythm. The whispers began again, soft, deliberate, curling into my thoughts. Keep driving, do not stop, follow, you cannot leave. I wanted to stop. I wanted to close my eyes, park the car, and hope the night would pass. But I knew better. Every instinct in me screamed that stopping would make me vanish too, swallowed by the patient, deliberate night. And so I drove, slow, careful, deliberate, eyes wide, scanning the fog, the shadows, the impossible arrangement of objects along the shoulder. Time had become meaningless. The moon rose and fell, or maybe it hadn't moved at all. I couldn't tell. The fog remained, curling, shifting, alive. The abandoned vehicles multiplied now, appearing suddenly, impossibly, as if they had never been there moments before. Rusted sedans, old pickup trucks, a minivan with cracked windows, each positioned as though placed deliberately for my observation. The presence behind me remained patient, always there. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror for long, fearing what I might see, or what I might fail to see. I could feel its attention, unwavering, deliberate, as if it existed in a parallel layer of reality folded over the one I was driving through. I noticed something odd. Every object along the roadside seemed to be oriented toward the road, toward me. Chairs leaned, bicycles spun, strollers rocked, all directed subtly, almost imperceptibly, guiding me forward. I felt the weight of their attention, patient and deliberate, as if they were not just objects but sentinels, watching my every move. I tried to leave again, forced a turn at what I thought was a junction, and yet the objects remained identical in arrangement. The fog curled as it had before. The streetlights flickered in the same uneven rhythm, and I realized with a creeping chill that I wasn't on a road anymore. I was inside a pattern, a loop, a design that existed only for me or that I had been caught in. The whispers became more insistent. You cannot leave, you are here, forever. They coiled around my thoughts, twisting logic and reason, embedding themselves deep in my mind. I tried to think, to rationalize, to find a flaw in the pattern, but the highway itself denied me clarity. Each turn, each exit, each attempt to escape brought me back to the same impossible stretch. And then the shadows began to move independently of the objects. They stretched across the asphalt, twisted around the fog, curling into impossible angles. Sometimes I thought I saw shapes within them, forms that resembled figures, fleeting and unreal. Each flicker of the streetlights revealed something new, some detail I couldn't explain, some movement I could not rationalize. I tried to scream. The voice was swallowed by the fog. I tried to slow, to pull over, to shut the engine off, but the car resisted. Tires gripped the asphalt as if the road itself demanded movement, and so I drove, patiently, endlessly, trapped in the deliberate loops of the night. Time became a meaningless measure. I could no longer tell how long I had been driving. Minutes, hours, maybe even days, all blended into one continuous stretch of unease. My body ached, my eyes burned. My thoughts circled in loops, mirroring the endless loops of the highway. And still the presence behind me remained, silent, patient, deliberate, watching. I glimpsed it once in the corner of my eye, a figure impossibly tall and thin standing at the edge of the fog. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze. And the whispers coiled around me again, softer this time, coaxing, almost tender. You are lost, lost forever, you belong here. I forced my hands to the wheel, gripping tightly. My knuckles whitened. I blinked repeatedly, trying to hold onto some shred of reality. But the objects, the fog, the looping highway, the flickering lights, they all pressed in, patient and deliberate, eroding any sense of certainty I had left. I tried to imagine the road behind me, the one I had entered hours before, the one that was supposed to lead to safety. But the memory was slippery, elusive, almost unreal. I couldn't remember the turns, the mile markers, the familiar signs. All I could remember was this stretch. This endless, looping stretch of highway where objects watched, shadows twisted, and the presence behind me waited. I realized then, with cold, creeping understanding, that I was not driving toward anything. I was driving inside something else, a pattern, a design, and I was its sole participant, its audience, its prisoner. The whispers continued, patient and deliberate, curling in my mind like smoke. You cannot leave, you are here, lost forever. And I knew they were right. The letter arrived on a gray morning, carried by a courier whose face I barely noticed and whose voice had been swallowed by the cold wind. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with the faint smell of lavender and old paper. No return address, just my name, written in careful, looping script that made me hesitate before opening it. You are invited. Those 3 words were all that greeted me when I unfolded the letter. Below, in slightly smaller handwriting, was an address in a part of town I had never ventured into. A winding road lined with trees whose bare branches intertwined like fingers reaching across the sky. There was a time noted, evening though no date. Something about it felt urgent yet polite, commanding yet gentle. I couldn't explain why, but I knew I would go. The thought of antique dolls had always held a strange fascination for me, not childish curiosity, but a quiet, reverent interest. Dolls were relics, frozen fragments of human intention, delicate and fragile, preserved from years long past. The letter promised a rare collection, and my curiosity overrode every practical concern. The journey there was longer than I expected. The streets narrowed, twisting in ways I didn't recall from any map. Houses became sparse, then entirely absent, replaced by thick hedges and darkened gardens that pressed close to the road. My headlights cut through the early dusk, illuminating patches of brick and stone, glimpses of fences, and then nothing at all. The air had a damp, earthy smell, as if the soil itself had absorbed centuries of quiet. Finally, I saw the house. It sat alone at the end of the winding road, larger than I had anticipated, with steep, sloping roofs and tall windows that reflected the last light of the day. There was a faint hum, almost imperceptible, like the vibrations of a string gently plucked, lingering in the air around it. I parked and approached slowly, each step making the gravel crunch beneath my shoes in exaggerated echoes. The front door opened before I could knock. A man appeared, thin and tall, with hair the color of ash and hands that seemed too delicate to be strong. His eyes were dark, deep-set, and filled with a quiet intensity. He smiled, polite but faintly unsettling, and gestured for me to enter. "Welcome," he said, voice soft, measured. "I've been expecting you." The interior was dimly lit, warm, with the scent of polished wood and something sweeter, heavier, almost floral. Every surface seemed deliberate. Books lined the walls, dusted with care. Curtains were drawn, but the fatting daylight filtered through in golden shafts that danced across the floor. And then I noticed them, the dolls. They were everywhere, on shelves in glass cabinets, seated in chairs, standing on mantels. Their eyes followed me, 1,000 tiny, painted or glass eyes, each with its own expression. Some smiled gently, others stared with intensity, and a few seemed almost sad, as though they had witnessed too much and held it in silence. The effect was disorienting. I felt both awe and unease. "Would you like tea?" the dollmaker asked, holding a delicate silver tray. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as if every gesture had been practiced for decades. I nodded, too distracted by the room, the dolls, the feeling that the walls themselves were watching. He poured the tea slowly, hands steady. I noticed a faint tremor in his smile, though it was subtle, almost imperceptible. "I collect them," he said softly. "All kinds, antique, rare, forgotten. Each has a story." I nodded again, unable to find words. My gaze wandered over the dolls. Some were familiar, Victorian porcelain with tiny, painted features, elegant dresses preserved in silk and lace. Others were strange, unfamiliar, with eyes too large, limbs twisted slightly. Expressions too perfect, too knowing. There was a hush in the room, a quiet expectation, as if the dolls themselves were waiting for me to speak, to act, to notice something beyond the ordinary. "Would you like to see my newest acquisitions?" he asked. There was a softness to his tone, but something under it was sharp, deliberate, pulling me forward. I nodded, following him down a narrow hallway lined with more dolls. Each cabinet, each shelf seemed to hold a different era, a different world. Some dolls had hair that looked real. Others had eyes that glinted in the dim light as if reflecting some unseen presence. He stopped in front of a tall glass cabinet, its door polished to perfection. Inside were 3 dolls I hadn't seen before. Their eyes were larger than most, almost human in their expression. Their hair was arranged with painstaking care, and their dresses were immaculate, colors deep and rich despite their apparent age. They were seated on tiny chairs, facing forward, as if prepared to greet a guest. "These," he whispered, "were found together in an abandoned estate. They had been left for decades, forgotten. Their last owner, well, that is a story for another time. I leaned closer. The doll's eyes seemed to follow me, not in the painted, mechanical way of other dolls, but in a manner that felt conscious. I froze slightly, a chill creeping along my spine. There was a presence in the room that I couldn't explain, subtle and patient. The dollmaker's eyes met mine, and for a moment I thought he saw what I saw. "They have a life of their own," he said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. "Not in the way you imagine, but they observe, they record, they remember." The words sent a shiver through me. I tried to swallow, to smile politely, to ignore the tiny surge of fear curling in my chest. I wanted to dismiss it as theatrics, part of his character, part of the experience. But the feeling persisted. Each doll seemed aware, attentive, like silent witnesses to everything in the room, to everything I had ever done or would do. We walked further into the house. Rooms unfolded like chapters in a story I hadn't read. Each held dolls of a different style, a different time. Some were pristine, delicate, elegant. Others were rougher, handmade, eyes too large, limbs twisted, expressions that felt too precise, almost deliberate. The room smelled faintly of wax and varnish, of old fabric, of something faintly metallic beneath it all. "You notice their eyes," the dollmaker said softly, stopping beside a cabinet filled with tiny, hand-carved figures. "It's natural. They see everything, even when you think no one is looking." I swallowed. I nodded, though the words didn't come. My pulse quickened, my mind trying to rationalize, to explain away the sensation of being observed, followed, examined. And yet rational thought failed. There was something deliberate in the way the dolls were arranged, something patient in their quiet attentiveness, something waiting. We moved into a larger room, almost a gallery, where dolls stood on pedestals, arranged in a careful pattern. They seemed to form a silent audience, watching, waiting. The dollmaker stood in the center, his hands folded, observing me, observing them. I felt an absurd tension, a quiet expectation pressing against me. "These are my finest," he said. "They have histories, some tragic, some unfinished. They remember what their owners could not, and sometimes they choose to tell you." The air grew heavier. Each word lingered, curling in the dim light like smoke. I couldn't look away from the dolls. They seemed to shift subtly when my attention wandered, moving imperceptibly, leaning forward just a fraction, turning their heads in ways impossible for porcelain and cloth. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, convinced I had imagined it, but the sensation remained. "I am curious," he said softly, stepping closer. "Curious about how visitors react. Most feel admiration, some fear, a few fascination, and some, very few, notice what lies beneath the surface." I felt a tightening in my chest. Something unspoken pressed in, deliberate and patient. The dolls had become more than objects. They were observers, witnesses, and I felt exposed, as if I were part of their collection, catalogued in silence. I wanted to leave. I wanted to step back into the ordinary night, to abandon this strange, meticulous world. But something held me there. Curiosity, unease, a subtle, inescapable pull that made my legs move, my hands reach, my eyes study each figure in turn. The dollmaker's gaze followed me, soft and deliberate. "Do you see them?" he whispered. "Not just the dolls, but the spaces between, the quiet, the attention. They notice when you are unaware. They remember what you do not wish to recall." I swallowed hard. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closer, the floor beneath my feet uneven. Shadows stretched along the cabinets and shelves, flickering with the dim light. The dolls seemed to lean subtly, just enough to feel alive. My pulse quickened, though my movements were careful, deliberate. I tried to focus on breathing, steadying myself. But the feeling persisted. Patient observation, quiet expectation. I realized then that this visit was not just about seeing dolls. It was about being seen, not by the dollmaker, but by the silent, deliberate audience that filled the room, waiting for acknowledgement, for recognition, for something only I could offer. And I wasn't sure I wanted to. I told myself it was nothing, just the play of light, shadows shifting across the room as the evening deepened. My eyes had been scanning the dolls for so long, taking in every delicate detail. The folds of their dresses, the fine painting of their faces, the meticulous arrangement of their hands, that my mind must have been exaggerating, imagining movement where none existed. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I looked at one, that brief instant when I glanced away and then back, I felt it, the sense of being observed, patient, and deliberate. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible, like the echo of a thought brushing against my own. Then it grew, subtle but undeniable. A tilt of a head, a shift of posture, the eyes, always the eyes. They seemed to follow me as I moved across the room, tracking my presence with quiet persistence. I shook my head, laughed softly, trying to dismiss it. Dolls didn't move. Dolls didn't see. Dolls didn't care. My pulse was faster than it should have been, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, deliberately, to ground myself in reason. Perhaps it was fatigue. Perhaps my curiosity, so sharp and insistent just hours ago, had finally pushed me too far. The doll maker was still nearby, hands folded, watching me with his quiet, deliberate intensity. He didn't speak, but the faintest curve of his lips suggested he knew what I was thinking. The dolls, he seemed to say without words, were always aware. I walked closer to the cabinet housing the newest acquisitions, the 3 dolls I had seen the day I arrived. Their eyes were unnervingly clear, glassy and bright in the dim light. They didn't blink, but I felt them follow me, tracking every movement, a patient attention that no human could maintain for so long. I felt a prickle along the back of my neck, the slow crawl of unease that spreads quietly, relentlessly. I leaned in, trying to study them more closely. Perhaps it was the angle, perhaps it was the reflection in the glass, but one of them seemed to shift ever so slightly. The hand on the left, resting delicately on the arm of the chair, had moved forward a fraction of an inch. I froze, heart hammering. I told myself I had imagined it, that my eyes had betrayed me. And yet when I looked again, the hand had shifted slightly back. I blinked rapidly, unsure whether to trust what I saw. "Are they moving?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The dollmaker's gaze held mine. His eyes were calm, unreadable, but his lips curved in a faint smile. "It is easy to see what one wants to see," he said softly. "But sometimes one sees what is real, whether one wishes it or not." I stepped back, telling myself to focus, to breathe. Perhaps it was my imagination, perhaps a trick of light on polished glass. But the feeling didn't leave. It grew heavier, pressing on my chest, curling around my mind like smoke. Each doll in the room seemed to stretch, subtly, leaning, turning, their heads tilting toward me in ways impossible for porcelain and cloth. I walked across the room slowly, studying other cabinets, other shelves. Dolls of every shape, era, and style observed me. Some smiled faintly, their painted lips soft and delicate. Others stared with intensity, glassy eyes reflecting a depth I couldn't comprehend. And with each glance, I felt the weight of attention pressing in, patient and deliberate. I tried to rationalize, to remind myself, they are dolls, they cannot move. They cannot see, they cannot care. But even as I repeated the thought, I felt the faintest shift of air, the subtle brush of movement from the corner of my vision. A doll's head seemed to twist, just slightly, toward me. A hand that had been resting now seemed to hold tension, poised, deliberate. I caught my reflection in a cabinet door, my own face, pale and tense, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker behind me, a shadow that didn't belong to my own body. I spun, heart pounding, only to see empty space. But the feeling remained. The dolls were aware, patient, watching. I tried to leave the room, to step away and regain a sense of normality. But as I moved, the room itself seemed to resist. Cabinets I had passed earlier now appeared closer, shelves rearranged subtly, the doll's gaze following, their attention unbroken. I felt a tightening in my chest, a quiet insistence that I could not ignore. The dollmaker moved silently beside me. "They notice," he said softly, almost conversationally. "Not like humans with judgment or reaction, but they observe. They retain, they remember, and sometimes they react. I swallowed hard, unease curling in my stomach. React? I asked, voice trembling slightly. His eyes met mine, calm, deliberate. Not always to you. Sometimes to the presence of the room itself, the weight of attention, the visitor who comes seeking something, or perhaps trying to escape it. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to ground myself. The dolls were inanimate, it was simple, yet every instinct in my body screamed otherwise. Every glance, every subtle movement I thought I saw, every flicker of glass eyes in dim light, suggested that something patient, deliberate, and aware existed here. Something that could observe and perhaps choose to respond. I circled the room, studying each cabinet, each shelf, each doll. Some had hair that looked real, so fine that it caught the light as I passed. Some had eyes that seemed wet, reflecting in a way that glass and paint should not. I tried to tell myself it was craftsmanship, attention to detail. But the feeling persisted, patient, deliberate observation, quiet insistence that I was noticed. I stopped before a cabinet with dolls from the late 1800s, their porcelain faces delicate, hands folded neatly. I leaned closer. One doll's eyes met mine, and for the first time I felt a shiver curl along my spine. I blinked and the gaze didn't shift, and yet I could not look away. A strange, impossible pull anchored me there, drawing my attention deeper, urging me to study, to notice, to acknowledge. I stepped back, heart racing, telling myself to calm down. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps the fascination I had felt, the quiet obsession with these delicate figures, had finally tipped over into irrational fear. But even as I told myself that, I felt the subtle shift, a hand adjusting its position, a head tilting slightly, an eye glinting with awareness. The dollmaker's voice broke the silence. "Do you feel it?" he asked softly. "That weight of observation, that quiet insistence." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, I feel it." He smiled faintly. "Good, you are attentive. That is necessary. Most do not notice. Most see only what is surface, what is obvious. But those who notice, they understand that the room has its own life, subtle, patient, deliberate. The dolls are its heart, its memory, its silent witnesses." I tried to step away again, but the room seemed to stretch, subtle changes making it feel larger, more complex. Cabinets that had been along the walls now appeared along corners I hadn't noticed. Shelves seemed closer, then farther. And the dolls, their gaze never left me. Always observing, always patient, always deliberate. I realized then that the feeling wasn't just about the dolls. It was about attention, presence, observation. The room itself, filled with its delicate occupants, demanded recognition, and I, unwilling or unable to resist, gave it. Time became irrelevant. Minutes, hours, it no longer mattered. My thoughts circled, tracing patterns I couldn't break. Every glance at a doll brought unease, fascination, dread, and curiosity simultaneously. I felt the slow, creeping realization that I was not just a visitor. I was part of the collection, cataloged in silence, noted by patient, deliberate eyes that could observe, retain, and perhaps even respond. I wanted to leave. I wanted to step back into the ordinary night, to abandon the room, the dolls, the quiet insistence of observation, but I could not. Something held me in place. A combination of fear, fascination, and the subtle pull of acknowledgement kept me rooted. The dolls, the room, the dollmaker himself, they all demanded attention. And attention, once given, could not easily be withdrawn. I took a step back, hands trembling slightly. My pulse was racing. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that the subtle movements, the tilts, the glances were tricks of light, exhaustion, and obsession. But deep down, I knew better. The dolls watched, patiently, deliberately, and I, for all my attempts at reason, had become aware that the awareness was mutual. The room fell silent again, save for the faint hum of the old house settling around us. I couldn't tell if I was breathing too loudly, if my pulse thumped too insistently, if the very act of noticing was enough to keep the room alive. And in that silence, I understood the truth. These dolls, these silent witnesses, were more than objects. They were observers, And I was not just a guest, I was under their gaze. I had thought I understood the house. I had thought the dolls, their patient observation, and the deliberate stillness of the rooms were the most unsettling aspects of my visit. I had been wrong. It happened when I reached the far end of a narrow hallway I hadn't noticed before. The corridor was dim, walls lined with faded wallpaper curling at the edges. The air was heavier here, warmer, scented faintly of old wood and something I couldn't place, iron perhaps, or a faintly metallic undertone that made the back of my throat tight. At the end of the hall was a door. Nothing remarkable except that it was locked. A simple brass doorknob, tarnished, the kind you might expect in an old house. Curiosity rose like a tide in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, to retreat to the relative safety of the rooms I had already seen. But my fascination with these dolls, with the quiet insistence of their presence, pushed me forward. I tried the knob, locked as I suspected. I knocked softly, almost apologetically. No response, just the quiet echo in the hallway, but there was a pressure, subtle and insistent, that made my fingers tingle, a sensation that the room beyond wasn't empty, that it had been waiting for me. The dollmaker appeared silently behind me, as if he had been there all along. "That room," he said softly, "is not often visited." "Why?" I asked, forcing calm into my voice, though my heart beat faster. He didn't answer immediately. He studied me with the same intensity he had shown since I arrived. "Some rooms," he said finally, "hold more than dolls. They hold memories, and sometimes they hold reminders of what was lost." I frowned. "What do you mean?" His eyes were steady, almost kind, but the slightest curve of his lips suggested amusement, or something more subtle, deliberate. "Go ahead," he said. "Open it if you dare." I hesitated. The rational part of me wanted to step back, to leave the room and pretend I hadn't noticed the lock, the faint pull of mystery that had been tugging at me. But the other part, the part that had led me here, that had pushed me to linger in hallways, to study every doll, to feel the weight of their eyes, compelled me forward. I turned the knob slowly, bracing for resistance. The lock clicked, surprisingly easily, and the door swung open with a quiet groan, revealing the room beyond. It was darker than the hallway, the light dim and filtered, shadows stretching across every surface. And then I saw them. Dolls, rows and rows of them, seated, standing, leaning, placed meticulously. At first they looked like the others I had seen. Victorian faces, delicate hands, glass eyes. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized with a jolt that they weren't like the others at all. These dolls resembled people I knew, or perhaps people I had known. Froze, my pulse quickened. The shapes, the expressions, the way their eyes seemed almost too lifelike. It was unnerving. And then I noticed the details that made it undeniable. Small imperfections in clothing, faint marks on faces, slight asymmetries that mirrored real people. My thoughts raced to the missing persons reports I had read recently in the newspaper. The teenager who had vanished last winter, the elderly man who had been gone for months, the woman who had disappeared without a trace last spring. And here they were, dolls perfectly preserved, eerily familiar. I swallowed hard. The air felt thicker, almost oppressive. I could hear my own breathing, loud and uneven in the silence. The doll's eyes seemed to follow me, not just in the mechanical sense, but in a way that made me feel exposed, catalogued, watched. The dollmaker stood just behind me, his hands folded, quiet, patient. "Do you recognize anyone?" he asked softly. I shook my head, though the images in my mind pressed forward, impossible to ignore. I think I do," I whispered, voice trembling. "They look like people from my neighborhood, people who have gone missing." He nodded slowly. "Yes, some of them, some were never found, some were forgotten. This room is for remembrance, for observation, for acknowledgement." I took a hesitant step forward. The dolls were arranged in rows, some seated in chairs, others standing on pedestals, a few leaning against walls. Each one was crafted with a painstaking attention to detail, their features, their expressions, even the folds of their clothing reflecting life as it had been before their disappearance. I felt a shiver run along my spine, a deep, cold awareness that this was more than craftsmanship. It was intent. I reached out, almost against my will, to touch the hand of one of the seated dolls. The fingers were cold, porcelain, unyielding, but the weight of presence was almost unbearable. It was as if the doll were aware that I was noticing it, cataloging it, acknowledging it. A strange, impossible sensation of consciousness pressed through the quiet. "They don't move," I whispered, mostly to myself, though my voice trembled. "They can't move." The dollmaker's smile was faint, almost unreadable. "Some things move in ways we cannot perceive. Some things respond to attention. You have noticed, and that is enough for now." I pulled my hand back, heart hammering. The room felt alive, not with breath or motion, but with quiet intent. The dolls were aware, patient, deliberate, and I, for all my attempts at reason, felt like a participant in their observation. I walked slowly down the rows, trying to maintain composure. Each doll seemed to hold a memory, a fragment of a life that had ended abruptly, without explanation. Some had eyes that gleamed faintly in the dim light, reflecting my own gaze back at me. Others leaned slightly, as though acknowledging my presence, patient and insistent. The room was quiet, but it was not silent. I could feel the weight of observation pressing in, subtle but unrelenting. Every glance, every step, every breath I took was catalogued, noted, acknowledged by these delicate, silent witnesses. I noticed a small figure in the corner, almost hidden in shadow. A child, seated in a tiny chair, eyes wide and unblinking, staring directly at me. The hair was tousled, the clothing worn, familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. I realized with a jolt that it resembled a boy who had disappeared from the neighborhood years ago, never found, never mentioned. And now he was here, preserved in quiet, deliberate stillness. My pulse quickened. I wanted to step back, to flee, but something held me there. Curiosity, fascination, fear, and the subtle pull of acknowledgement, an impossible, patient insistence that I could not ignore. The dollmaker moved closer, voice low and measured. "Do you understand?" I swallowed hard, nodding. I think so." "They are more than dolls," he said softly. "They are reminders, observers, witnesses, and sometimes they are the only presence left when the world forgets." I stepped back again, taking in the rows, the careful arrangement, the impossible familiarity. I felt a strange, vertiginous pull, the sensation that time itself had folded here, that these figures, silent and delicate, held more than memory. They held attention, presence, deliberate awareness. I realized then that the room was not just a collection. It was a statement, a quiet insistence that absence mattered, that disappearance could not erase attention, that those who were gone still had witnesses, even if only these delicate, silent figures. The air felt heavier with every passing moment. I could feel the eyes of the dolls, each a patient observer, cataloging, remembering, pressing quietly on my awareness. I understood, finally, why the door had been locked, why the hallway had remained hidden. Not all visitors were ready to see this. Not all visitors were willing to acknowledge the deliberate presence of absence made manifest. I stepped back toward the door, hesitant, heart racing. The dollmaker followed silently, calm and deliberate. "Most leave," he said softly. "Some stay too long, but noticing is not the same as being consumed. And you have noticed." I nodded, swallowing hard, trying to calm the rapid beat of my heart. The room remained, patient, deliberate, unchanged, except for the weight of awareness that seemed to press on my chest, my mind, my very perception of reality. I realized then that leaving would not free me from the memory, from the impression, from the quiet insistence that the room, the dolls, and the absent lives they represented had left upon me. This was not a momentary encounter. It would linger, patient and deliberate, echoing in the quiet corners of my mind long after I stepped back into the ordinary world. I turned to leave, the door clicking shut behind me with a quiet finality. And though the room was now behind me, its presence, patient and deliberate, remained. The dolls, the lost, the remembered, they had not stopped observing, and neither had I in ways I did not yet understand. Sleep should have been a relief. I had expected, once the house was quiet, that I could close my eyes and let the day's unease fade into unconsciousness. But that relief never came. The moment I lay down in the guest room, beneath a thin, scratchy blanket that smelled faintly of dust and old wood, the house seemed to shift, subtle but deliberate. At first, it was nothing more than a whisper of movement in the corners of my vision, shadows stretching where they should not. I told myself it was exhaustion, that my mind had grown too sensitive after hours wandering these halls. But the sensation persisted, growing heavier, a pressure in the room that pressed against my chest, soft but insistent. And then I heard it. At first it was barely audible, a faint murmur indistinct like the sigh of air through cracks in the walls. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. My pulse throbbed in my ears, loud and insistent, but beneath it was another sound. Words, or something very like them, low and deliberate, soft and patient. I told myself I was imagining it. Dolls don't speak. Dolls don't breathe. Dolls can't whisper. But the words grew clearer, insistent. Voices, overlapping, layered, as though coming from every corner of the room at once. I couldn't make out all of them, but one voice, soft and deliberate, repeated a phrase that made my stomach twist. "You took her, you took them." I sat up sharply, heart hammering. The room was empty. Nothing moved. Shadows lay still. Only the dolls, seated on shelves and chairs, watched silently. But their eyes, always those unblinking eyes, seemed more focused than ever. There was a tension in the air, a weight that seemed to pin me to the bed, insisting that I listen. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to rationalize. The house was old. The walls creaked. My imagination was overactive. Perhaps exhaustion, perhaps the isolation, perhaps the way the dim light from the hallway cast shadows in unexpected angles. All of these were enough to explain whispers. Yet the words continued, insistent, deliberate. "You know what you did." I closed my eyes, telling myself to ignore it, to will it away. But sleep did not come. I felt the presence of the room pressing in, patient and deliberate, and with it, a creeping sense of guilt I did not recognize. Guilt for something I had never done, for crimes that had never touched my life. Yet they were recounted to me as if I were an accomplice, as if I had played some hidden role in darkness I could not remember. The whispers intensified. I could make out fragments now, quiet and urgent, sometimes overlapping in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. "Why did you leave her? She trusted you. Do you remember?" Each phrase was delivered softly, deliberately, as though the dolls themselves had taken a measure of my memory, weighing it, reminding me of sins that did not exist. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it, but the sensation only grew stronger, curling around my thoughts like smoke, invasive and relentless. I tried to leave the bed to escape the oppressive air, but the floor seemed farther away than it should have been, the room stretching subtly, impossibly. I could feel the pull of observation, the weight of attention, patient and deliberate, pressing down from the shelves, from the shadows, from every porcelain face that reflected my panic back at me. I whispered to myself, quiet, desperate, "It's not real, it's not real, it's not real." But the voices did not stop. They grew clearer, sharper, more precise. "You thought you could hide," one voice said, soft and unyielding. "They are waiting," another added, a thin edge of accusation underlying the syllables. "Remember what happened," a third whispered, drawing out the last word with deliberate emphasis. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to shut it out, but it did not help. The sound did not come through air alone. It was deeper, layered in the very walls, the very atmosphere. The whispers came from within the room, within the house, and somehow, impossibly, within my own mind. Panic began to rise, slow and insidious. I had expected the dolls to be unsettling, their eyes following me, their silence deliberate. But I had not anticipated this. The sense that they could speak without words, that they could manipulate perception, that they could whisper guilt, dread, and accusation into the quiet of my consciousness. I tried to leave the room. I wanted to flee to the hallway, to the faint safety of the lighted spaces I had explored earlier. But my body felt heavy, reluctant to obey. The whispers followed, soft and patient, insistent and accusing. My own rational mind screamed that it was impossible, but the sensation of being held in place, watched, judged, was undeniable. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes and years at once. Sleep remained elusive. Every time my eyes closed, I imagined eyes opening in the dark, glassy orbs reflecting not only the room but my own fear back at me. Every time I breathed, I felt the room inhale with me, subtle, deliberate, and invasive. I don't know how long I sat there, on the edge of the bed, head bowed, hands pressed to my temples, whispering to myself to resist, to ground myself, to breathe. I remember fragments: the soft hum of the house, the delicate creak of the floorboards, the faint metallic scent of dust and old wood, the subtle pressure of the air as though the room itself had weight. I realized then that I was not merely witnessing, I was participating. Each glance, each acknowledgement, each whisper heard by my mind gave the room, gave the dolls, a measure of life, a measure of attention, and attention once given cannot be withdrawn. I tried to close my eyes again to will the whispers away, but even in darkness, they continued, patient, deliberate, unyielding. They recounted crimes I had never committed, whispered names I did not recognize but felt faintly familiar, pressed upon the corners of memory I did not know existed. I tried to rationalize: exhaustion, imagination, isolation, the power of suggestion, all of it. And yet none of it relieved the dread. It pressed against me, insistent and patient, curling around my mind like smoke, infiltrating the edges of perception until I could no longer separate the room from myself. At some point, I realized I was trembling, not with cold, not with hunger, not with ordinary fear, but with the slow, creeping awareness that the house had claimed me in small ways already. That the dolls, in their deliberate silence, their patient observation, and now in their whispers, had begun to shape my consciousness, tracing patterns of guilt, fear, and recognition I could not escape. And yet I could not leave. The pull of curiosity, the fascination with their quiet insistence, the impossible desire to know more, kept me there. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening, enduring, acknowledging. Every whisper was a thread, weaving me into the tapestry of the house, of the dolls, of the patient, deliberate observation that had begun the moment I arrived. When the first faint gray light of dawn crept through the curtains, I realized I had not slept, not even a moment. The whispers receded, or perhaps my exhaustion had dulled them, but the sense of presence remained. I felt it in every joint, in every breath, in every heartbeat. The dolls, patient and deliberate, had not left. They had only paused, waiting, watching, remembering. I rose slowly, moving mechanically through the room. Each doll's eyes seemed sharper, more aware in the pale light. Each shadow seemed deliberate, precise, a reflection of the weight I had carried through the night. And though I stepped out into the hallway, into spaces bathed in ordinary sunlight, I knew that sleep would never again be simple. Because once you have been observed, once you have heard whispers that recount acts you have never committed, once you have felt the deliberate attention of beings that exist in forms familiar yet impossible, there is no return. There is only acknowledgement, observation, and the patient, relentless weight of memory and presence that cannot be shaken. I knew then that the night had changed me, that the whispers, the observation, the patient insistence of the dolls would linger, that every shadow, every soft creak of a floorboard, every faint sound in quiet hours would carry a fragment of the room, a fragment of the attention, a fragment of the impossible, deliberate awareness I had endured. And I understood finally that sleep, if it ever came again, would always be accompanied by whispers, patient, deliberate, inescapable. I woke slowly, the kind of groggy awareness that comes after a long night with almost no sleep. The morning light was faint, filtered through heavy curtains, but something felt different. There was a stillness in the air that I hadn't noticed before, a weight pressing subtly at my chest, almost like the house itself was watching me more closely than ever. At first, I didn't see it. I thought I was alone in the room, that nothing had changed since the night before, that the whispers had faded with the faint light of dawn. But then my eyes settled on the table near the corner of the room. And there it was. A doll. Its placement was deliberate, precise. It sat upright on the polished surface, tiny hands resting gently on its lap. At first glance, it looked like the others. A porcelain face, glassy eyes, delicate clothing, the subtle craft of a careful hand. But as my vision sharpened, as my pulse began to hammer, I realized this one was different. It was me. Every detail mirrored my own appearance. The shape of the jaw, the curve of the mouth, the way my hair fell over my forehead, even the subtle lines on the face, the small imperfections that I had always felt were unique, were captured here with unsettling precision. I could feel my stomach tighten as I stared. My own features, rendered small and silent, staring back at me. I couldn't move at first. I tried to breathe, tried to tell myself it was just another doll, another trick of the house, another element of this unnerving collection. But the truth pressed down on me like a weight I could not shake. Someone or something had made this. Someone or something had observed me so closely that it could replicate me in porcelain and cloth. I reached out with trembling hands, almost against my better judgment. The doll's surface was smooth and cold, lifeless in the literal sense, but the effect it had on me was the opposite of lifeless. There was an awareness in its form, a deliberate intention that made my skin crawl. It was not simply a replica, it was an acknowledgement, a witness, a silent, immovable reflection of myself, trapped in the quiet artistry of the room. As I stood frozen, the faint creak of the door behind me drew my attention. I turned, heart hammering, to the entrance of the room. The knob, the simple brass knob I had become familiar with, did not turn. I tried again, twisting with increasing force, panic beginning to seep into my veins, but it would not budge. The door was locked from the inside. The reality struck me in a slow, icy wave. I was trapped. I backed away from the table, my gaze flicking constantly between the door and the doll. I had no idea how long I had been in this room, how long the house had waited for this moment. The whispers of the previous night had not fully left me. They lingered, faint and patient, at the edges of my awareness. And now, with this final doll, the weight of observation was absolute. I was the observed, the catalogued, the acknowledged. I circled the room slowly, testing the windows, inspecting the walls, but everything was as it had been. There were no hidden exits, no cracks to exploit, no faint gaps that might offer a chance of escape. The room had become a capsule, and I was inside it, aware in a way I could not fully articulate. The doll remained on the table, an unwavering presence, its eyes fixed in my direction. I tried to look away, tried to distract myself, but something held my gaze. I felt it in my chest, a tightness that grew heavier with every passing second. It was not merely a doll. It was a statement, a reminder, a presence that demanded acknowledgement. I sank onto the edge of the bed, trying to calm the tremor in my hands. I had experienced fear before, yes, in ordinary ways. Shadows in dark hallways, the sound of wind rattling a loose window, the sudden creak of a floorboard. But this was different. This was not the fear of the moment. It was the fear of recognition, the dread of being observed, catalogued, and in some subtle way measured. I spoke aloud, my voice trembling. What is this?" No answer came, at least not in words I could understand, but the air itself seemed to respond. The room pulsed subtly, the silence filled with a patient, deliberate weight. I imagined the other dolls in the house, each a silent witness, each an observer of all who had entered. And now, with this final doll, I was part of the collection. I remembered the whispers from the previous night, faint phrases that had drilled into my consciousness, recounting acts I had never committed, pressing a sense of guilt and dread onto my mind. And I realized with a jolt that the final doll had made those whispers more personal, more intimate. I was no longer merely a witness to the house's power. I was the subject, the intended focus. I stood abruptly, moving toward the doll, almost as if approaching it might somehow shift the balance, might break the spell of observation. But the closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to become, pressing against my chest, my lungs, my mind. The doll did not move, did not blink, did not speak. And yet I could feel its awareness, deliberate and patient, like a weight pressing into the edges of my consciousness. I sat back on the bed, heart racing. I did not understand how the doll could have been made, how anyone or anything could have observed me so closely, replicated my form so precisely. Rational thought faltered at the edges of fear. Logic and reason seemed almost irrelevant in the face of this deliberate, patient awareness. Hours passed, though time became meaningless. Every creak of the house, every faint draft, every subtle shift in shadow was magnified, amplified, measured. The doll remained on the table, constant, deliberate. The door remained locked, and I, caught between curiosity and terror, awareness and panic, remained within the room, unable to escape the weight of presence. I tried to sleep again, but the notion was impossible. The house, the dolls, the final figure on the table, all demanded my attention. My mind traced patterns of observation, presence, and memory, searching for understanding, searching for a way to reclaim ordinary perception. But none came. Only the patient weight of the house, the deliberate stillness of the dolls, and the impossible acknowledgement of myself in porcelain form. I thought of the other visitors, those who had come before me. Perhaps some had stayed too long, perhaps some had left, but none had been so directly acknowledged. The final doll was a message, a culmination. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to misinterpret. And I understood with a shiver that ran through every nerve that the house had chosen me in a way that was quiet, deliberate, and permanent. I sank to the floor, back against the wall, and tried to breathe. The final doll, placed with careful attention on the table, seemed almost to radiate the awareness I had experienced through the night. It was patient, it was deliberate, and it was undeniable. Time passed in a strange, impossible way. I do not know how long I remained on the floor, eyes fixed on that small, delicate figure. The house did not change. The doll did not move. But the presence, the deliberate attention, pressed on me like a tide I could not escape. When I finally rose again, I realized the truth of the situation. I could not leave. Not through the door, not through the windows, not through any means of ordinary escape. The house had claimed me in a way subtle but absolute. I was observed. I was catalogued. I was present in a deliberate, impossible awareness that had begun with curiosity and ended with acknowledgement. I looked at the final doll again. My own reflection, captured in porcelain and cloth, seated patiently on the table. I realized that it would remain long after I had left, or perhaps I would never leave. I realized that the whispers, the attention, the deliberate observation that had begun with the first dolls had reached their culmination. And I knew, with an almost unbearable clarity, that nothing in the ordinary world could undo what had begun here. I sank back into a chair, defeated, trembling. The room, the house, the dolls, all waited quietly, patiently, deliberately. And I understood fully and completely that I had become part of the collection. Not in body, perhaps, but in attention, in observation, in the quiet acknowledgement of existence. The final doll was not merely a toy. It was a message, a statement, a reminder. And as I sat in the quiet, my own features reflected back at me in that small, deliberate figure. I knew that the house, the dolls, and the patient, relentless attention would follow me wherever I went, in every shadow, every creak, every subtle sound of the ordinary world. Sleep would never come easily again. The final doll, patient and deliberate, would remain in my mind, a presence as real and unyielding as the walls that held me. And though the door was locked, though I was trapped in the room in ways I could not fully comprehend, I understood that the true confinement was not physical. It was awareness, observation, the patient, inescapable gaze of the house, and now of myself. The first time I saw the asylum, I was struck by how little it seemed to belong to the present. Its walls were cracked and gray, the windows darkened with grime and age, and the gates, rusted, bent, sagging, looked as though they had not been closed properly in decades. It was easy to imagine the place still echoing with the distant cries of those long gone, their memories trapped in the peeling paint, in the hollow corridors, in the cold, unfeeling stones. I parked a little way down the road, the gravel crunching under my shoes as I approached. My bag hung heavily over one shoulder, filled with notebooks, pens, and a flashlight that cast a narrow cone of light onto the entrance. A historian's tools, nothing more. And yet, even as I stepped forward, I felt the weight of the place, an oppressive pressure that settled over me like a thick, damp fog. Inside, the air was stale, a mixture of dust, mold, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't identify. The corridor stretched ahead, long and shadowed, lined with peeling wallpaper that had once been a pale yellow but now looked closer to the color of decay itself. I could hear my own footsteps echoing, each step sounding far too loud, as though the building itself wanted me to notice every movement, every choice I made. I pulled out my notebook and began to jot down observations, trying to keep my breathing steady. The history of this place was notorious, yes, but I had never been inside one so thoroughly abandoned. There were stories of cruel experiments, of patients confined in ways that defy imagination, and though I had read about them in dusty archives and yellowed newspapers, nothing compared to standing here, where the silence pressed against your skin like a living thing. It was in one of the first rooms I entered that I found a journal. It lay on a rusted metal table, the cover worn and cracked. I bent closer, brushing away a layer of dust, and opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was meticulous, almost obsessive, and I recognized the name on the cover, Dr. Harland, a physician who had once supervised the asylum in the early 1900s. The entries were clinical at first, notes on patients' behavior, observations of conditions, meticulous records of daily routines. But soon a darker pattern emerged. Experiments, treatments that were anything but humane. One patient had been restrained for weeks with barely a blanket for comfort. Another was subjected to strange, untested procedures that caused convulsions and bleeding. The author wrote without emotion, almost as if the cruelty were a matter of procedure rather than wrongdoing. I felt my stomach tighten. I had read about medical abuses in historical texts, of course, but reading the words written by someone who had carried them out, it was different, immediate, real. I imagined the patients in those rooms, their small, fragile bodies subjected to deliberate pain, and a chill ran down my spine. I continued through the asylum slowly, letting my flashlight sweep across the walls and floors. Every room told a story. Rusted beds with restraints still attached, broken glass scattered across the floor, the faint outline of letters scratched into the walls by someone who had long since been forgotten. I could almost hear the echoes of screams, soft and distant, and I found myself pausing to listen, telling myself it was only the wind, the house settling, the imagination running wild. But the journals, I kept finding them. Each one told of experiments more bizarre and cruel than the last. They documented treatments designed to cure conditions we now know were misunderstood, mislabeled, or entirely imagined. Shock therapy without anesthesia, isolation rooms that left people screaming for days, medications administered in doses far beyond what was safe. And always, the clinical detachment of the doctor writing it down, as if documenting the suffering were more important than preventing it. I paused in a long corridor, flashlight tracing the peeling wallpaper, my hand shaking slightly as I held the journal open. The entries were recent enough to be chilling, not in years or decades, but in the language, the phrasing, the deliberate attention to detail. There was a sense of meticulous control, a focus on observation and measurement that was almost mechanical, almost inhuman. Yet, despite the detached tone, I could feel the traces of the lives affected. the quiet horror of people trapped behind walls that were never meant to be opened again. A draft swept down the hallway, and I felt the journal slip slightly in my grip. I tightened my hold, pressing it against my chest, and looked around. The hallway stretched endlessly, shadows pooling in the corners, doors slightly ajar as though someone or something had moved them recently. I tried to tell myself that the asylum had been abandoned for decades, that no one else could possibly be here. Yet the subtle movement, the shifting of shadows, made my stomach clench. I moved to another room, a small office that had once belonged to an administrator, I think. Files were stacked in neat piles, but most had rotted into dust. The air was heavier here, the faint smell of iron stronger, as though it had soaked into the walls themselves. I opened a drawer carefully, finding another journal, this one smaller, more private. The handwriting was sharper, almost frantic at times, with notes about patients who resisted treatment and required observation. Some entries were hastily scrawled, words overlapping, corrections scribbled over mistakes. I felt a strange sense of being watched. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was only the architecture, the way the building carried sound, how the empty corridors can make a person feel as if eyes are following them. Yet the sensation persisted, a weight pressing from the edges of my awareness. The journal described a patient, a young woman, subjected to long periods of isolation. Her screams had been ignored, her protests dismissed as hysteria. Reading it, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I imagined her sitting alone in that cold room, her mind shrinking under the weight of silence and fear. I tried to look away, tried to focus on the facts, on the dates, the details, but my thoughts kept returning to her. The image of someone trapped, unheard and unseen, pressed into my mind like an imprint. I moved carefully through the rooms, flashlight sweeping. Every corner was filled with the ghosts of what had been. Broken chairs, rusted instruments, faint stains on floors that time had failed to erase. The journals I carried became heavier, not in weight but in presence. Each page was a whisper from the past, a reminder of what had happened here, of the deliberate cruelty that had passed unnoticed by the world outside these walls. At one point, I stopped in a room with barred windows. The bars were thick and cold to the touch, remnants of a time when patients had been confined for weeks or months on end. The floor was littered with shards of glass, and faint scratches lined the walls, words scratched in desperate attempts to be heard. My hand hovered over the markings, tracing them lightly, as if touching them might bring some understanding. But understanding did not come, only the weight of history pressing down with subtle insistence. The journals, the records, the architecture itself, all spoke of control, of observation, of deliberate confinement. And in the quiet, I felt something shift. Not physically, but in the air, a subtle awareness, almost imperceptible, as if the house itself had remembered and was acknowledging my presence. I moved on, but the sensation did not fade. Shadows seemed to pool more deliberately now, corners of the halls darker than they should have been, the faint echoes of movement just out of reach of my hearing. I tried to focus on my work, on the journals, on the careful recording of history. But the house, with its long corridors and peeling walls, its barred windows and rusted beds, was insistent in its presence. I realized that the asylum was not merely abandoned. It was waiting for someone to walk its halls, to notice the details, to acknowledge what had been done. And I, historian though I am, realized with an uneasy certainty that I had become the subject of its attention. Every step, every movement, every breath seemed to echo in the corridors, reflected in the silence, absorbed into the very walls. By the time I reached the central hall, the day had grown thin, sunlight barely filtering through the grime-streaked windows. I stopped, journal in hand, and looked back at the rooms I had explored. Each one had its own history, its own cruel tales, its own weight pressing on the present. And yet I could not leave. Not entirely. I could not shake the feeling that the asylum, in its patient, deliberate silence, had begun to claim me, to wrap me in awareness as it had those long forgotten. I set the journals on a table in the central hall and took a deep breath. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust, rust, and the faint iron tang of memory. I wanted to leave, wanted to step back into the sunlight and ordinary world, but a subtle voice at the edge of consciousness whispered insistently. Not a voice I could hear with my ears, but one I felt in my chest, in my mind. Observe, remember, do not leave too quickly. And so I stayed a while longer, documenting, nodding, recording. Each page of the journal I copied, each observation I made, tethered me to the asylum. I could feel the past brushing against my mind, delicate and insistent. Each corner, each shadow, each whisper of air through a broken window carried the weight of lives that had been contained, controlled, and in too many cases destroyed. When I finally stepped out of the building, I did so with a sense of unease that I could not shake. The air outside was fresher, lighter, but the shadows of the asylum clung to me. In the quiet moments that followed, I could still hear faint echoes of movement, faint traces of whispers, the subtle pressure of presence that refused to leave. The journals, carefully packed, were heavy in my bag, but it was not just their weight. It was the knowledge, the awareness, the creeping certainty that the asylum's attention had followed me. That the walls, the corridors, the patient, deliberate cruelty had somehow been passed on, imprinted into my own consciousness. And I knew, even as I walked down the gravel road away from the building, that I would return. Not because I wanted to, not because it was safe, but because once a place like this has observed you, once it has inscribed its memory into your awareness, it does not let go easily. The asylum waited, patient, deliberate, and I had only begun to understand its depths. I had returned to the asylum the next day, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and unease I couldn't explain. Even in daylight, the building seemed unwilling to let go of its shadows. The front gates sagged heavier than I remembered, the rust spreading across the metal like a slow, deliberate stain. I felt the same tightness in my chest I had felt the day before, though I tried to tell myself it was only anticipation, a historian's careful attention to details I was about to record. The first hallway I entered stretched farther than memory should allow. Sunlight filtered weakly through grimy windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the narrow beams. I stepped carefully, notebook in one hand, flashlight in the other, and tried to focus on the physical details. Peeling wallpaper, rusted radiators, a door hanging crookedly on its hinges. But soon, the familiar sense of presence returned. At first, it was subtle, a soft scrape on the floor somewhere ahead, a whisper of movement that did not belong to me. I paused, heart quickening, listening. I told myself it was the building settling, the wind pressing through cracks. But the sound came again, the faintest echo of footsteps, deliberate and slow, following me down the corridor. I froze. The sound was distant yet precise, perfectly matching my own pace, never overtaking me, never falling behind. It was a patient mimicry, an echo of life where none should exist. I whispered aloud, trying to ground myself. It's just the building, just my imagination. But the words sounded hollow, swallowed by the stillness around me. I moved forward cautiously, each step measured, trying not to provoke the space into revealing more. The hallway narrowed slightly as I advanced, the walls seeming to bow inward just enough that I had to adjust my posture. My chest tightened with every step, as though the air itself was resisting my movement. Shadows pooled in the corners, dark and still, but I could feel their weight pressing against my awareness. A door to my left was slightly ajar. I hesitated, the urge to peek battling with a stronger sense of dread. My hand rested lightly on the frame, and I felt the cold seep through my skin. I pushed the door open slowly, revealing a small room with a single bed. Dust covered everything, and the faint scent of iron lingered in the air. I stepped inside, flashlight sweeping the room, and froze. On the floor near the far corner, I saw a journal. Another one. Its cover was worn and cracked, and the handwriting inside immediately drew me in. I knelt to examine it, careful not to disturb the thin layer of dust. The entries were different this time, more urgent, fragmented, almost frantic. They spoke of patients left alone for hours, then days, sometimes weeks. The author described sounds, screams, cries, whispers, that haunted the halls, dismissed by the staff as hysteria. But as I read, I felt a dissonance in the room itself. A soft murmur seemed to float just beyond comprehension, curling around the edges of my mind. I could not place it with my ears, and yet it was unmistakable. Something was whispering. I stood abruptly, the journal still clutched in my hands, and scanned the corridor. It appeared empty, silent, and yet the faintest scraping echoed again behind me. I spun, flashlight trembling slightly, and caught the edge of a shadow moving just beyond the light. I told myself it was impossible. The asylum had been abandoned for decades. There was no one here, and yet the footsteps followed, soft, deliberate, patient. I tried to quicken my pace, and they quickened with me, matching step for step. Panic rose slowly in my chest. It was not sudden, but insistent, growing with each turn I took, each shadow I passed. The corridors twisted in ways that defied memory. Doors I had just passed seemed to reappear. Corners stretched farther than they should, walls narrowing subtly until I had to squeeze through. Every turn made me feel smaller, more contained, as if the asylum itself were closing in around me. My flashlight trembled in my hands, my chest heaving as I tried to steady my breathing. I found another room, this one larger, the walls lined with metal cabinets. I rifled through them carefully, the noise sharp in the still air. Most were empty or filled with dust, but in one I found another journal. Its pages were filled with charts, names, observations of behavior, notes on isolation, on restraint, on the small, precise methods used to manipulate patients' minds. The entries were clinical, detached, but I could feel the traces of suffering embedded between the lines. I traced my finger lightly over one of the pages, a patient's name written in neat cursive. The description of their treatment was chilling. Long periods without interaction, observation of every small movement, careful recording of reactions to minimal stimuli. I shivered, closing the journal. I had read accounts of cruel experiments before, but the immediacy of this place, the echoes in the corridors, made it impossible to dismiss as history. The whispering grew slightly louder, subtle but insistent. I stopped in the center of the room, listening. It was not a voice I could identify, not in words I could comprehend, but it carried urgency, almost like a warning. The walls seemed to pulse with attention, closing subtly around me, narrowing the space as if the asylum itself were alive, aware, patient in its observation. I moved on, stepping into another hallway. The light of my flashlight carved narrow beams into the darkness, but shadows seemed to cluster just beyond the edges. I could feel them, pressing subtly at my consciousness. The soft cries returned, low and distant, almost like someone weeping quietly in the next room. My hands shook as I jotted down notes, trying to record, trying to make sense, trying to maintain a rational grip on a situation that was slipping away from reason. At one door I paused, feeling a cold draft brush my cheek. I placed my hand on the frame and shivered. Inside, the room was bare except for a single chair, tipped over as if someone had left in haste. The air was heavier here, thick with a sense of presence I could not place. The whispers seemed clearer now, though still unintelligible, circling around the edges of my mind, curling into every corner of perception. I stepped forward cautiously, and the chair scraped slightly against the floor. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence that pressed harder than the previous noise. My heart beat so loudly it was almost painful, each thump echoing through my skull. I forced myself to breathe, counting silently. 1, 2, 3, until the echo of my heartbeat seemed to fade into the background of the building's patients. The hallway beyond the room seemed longer now. I moved forward slowly, flashlight illuminating the cracked tiles, the peeling paint, the faded marks of what might once have been cheerful colors on the walls. But nothing here was cheerful. Every corner carried weight, every shadow suggested a presence. Every creak or groan of the building seemed like deliberate communication. I reached a junction in the corridor and paused. The air was thick with anticipation, a slow, pressing tension. I could hear it again, the softest echo of footsteps following me but not directly behind. To my left, right, it was impossible to locate. I whispered to myself, voice barely audible, "It's just the building, it's just me imagining." But the sensation persisted. I felt watched. Not in the casual sense, not like someone might glance from a distance. I felt observed, measured, as though every movement, every breath, every thought were catalogued in the space around me. The building itself had begun to assert a deliberate awareness, patient, insistent, subtle. I tried to focus on the journals I had collected, leafing through pages as I walked, using the act of writing and reading as an anchor. The words described isolation, observation, cruelty, but I could not stop thinking about the present, about the soft footsteps, the cries that came without origin, the sense of walls closing in. I was being drawn into the asylum's memory, and I could not resist. The corridors twisted again subtly. A door I had passed moments before now stood slightly ajar, revealing a room I could not recall. Shadows pooled in the corners, and I could feel the faint pressure of air moving against me, brushing my skin, curling into my mind. The softest whisper brushed at my ear. My breath caught. I spun, flashlight cutting through the gloom. Nothing. And yet I felt it, watching, waiting. The asylum itself, alive in its own patient, deliberate way. The journals, the records, the remnants of cruelty, they had made it this way, embedded a presence into the walls that could feel, could observe, could acknowledge me. I pressed forward slowly, documenting, recording, writing. Each step was deliberate, careful. I could not outrun the sensation, could not shake the pressure, could not escape the whispered presence. The corridors, the walls, the shadows, they moved with me, though subtly, almost imperceptibly, until I felt wrapped in a slow, creeping awareness I could not name. By the time I found a stairwell leading to the upper floors, I realized the truth. The asylum was patient, deliberate, and insistent. It had observed me before I even crossed the threshold, and it would continue observing. The soft cries, the footsteps, the walls closing subtly around me, they were not tricks of the mind. They were part of the building, embedded in its memory, inescapable and constant. I ascended slowly, each step measured, careful, deliberate. The whispering followed, soft, faint, never overwhelming but never absent. The corridors above were darker, narrower, more oppressive. I could feel the air pressing against my chest, and with every turn I felt smaller, more contained, more present in the deliberate observation of the asylum itself. I paused at the top of the stairs, taking a breath, flashlight sweeping the hallway ahead. The journals weighed in my hands, heavy not in mass but in presence. I realized then that I was no longer merely recording history. I had become part of it, observed, measured, catalogued. The asylum had reached into me, embedding its slow, insistent awareness into my mind. And I knew, even as I continued down the dark corridor, that the building would not release me so easily. The whispers, the soft footsteps, the feeling of walls closing in, they would follow, patient, persistent, unseen but undeniable. The hidden wing revealed itself almost accidentally. A narrow stairwell I had passed before, half concealed behind a hanging panel, led downward into a darkness that seemed thicker than the rest of the asylum. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The air smelled different here, staler, heavier, tinged with something I couldn't name. I had read about old ventilation systems trapping scents for decades, but this was different. It clung to my skin, pressing into my senses as if aware of my presence. I took a slow breath, then another, trying to steady myself. Every instinct screamed that I should turn back, that curiosity was a poor companion in this place. But something drew me forward. Perhaps it was the journalist's urge to uncover the story. Perhaps it was the historian's fascination with places left to rot. I stepped down the first stair, then the next, the sound of my boots muted by thick dust and decades of neglect. The corridor below opened into a long hall, narrower than those above, walls lined with rusting metal doors. Each door was numbered, faded paint peeling in jagged patterns. I could almost feel the names that had once been affixed to these doors, scratched off, erased, forgotten by the world, but not by the building. I ran my fingers along the chipped paint, tracing the sequence. 12, 13, 14. The numbers went on like an unbroken chain, endless in their repetition. The whispers started again. Softer here, subtler, but more intimate. It was as though the building was leaning closer, pressing its breath against my ear, murmuring secrets in a language I could almost understand. I pressed the flashlight into the darkness, moving slowly, step by step. I had to see. I had to know. Some doors were locked, heavy and rusted, but others were cracked open, revealing glimpses of small rooms. I peered into the first. The room was empty save for an old metal bed frame and a chair tipped on its side. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by my intrusion, swirling in the narrow beams of my flashlight. And yet I could feel a presence. It was faint at first, like the echo of a thought left behind. The weight of someone or something, having existed here and never truly leaving. I moved from room to room, each one similar in appearance but different in subtle ways. Marks on the walls, scratches, gouges, faint stains, hinted at lives lived under strict control, under observation. I tried to imagine what it would be like to exist in these small spaces, confined for days, weeks, perhaps months, with only the staff's cruelty and indifference for company. My chest tightened. I had read about patient records before, yes, but the reality of standing here in these rooms made the horror intimate, immediate. In one room, a faint smell caught me, a mixture of iron, mildew, and something almost metallic but warmer. My flashlight flickered briefly as I bent down to investigate. Under the bed, partially hidden by dust, lay a bundle of old papers tied with string. I retrieved them carefully, my hands shaking. The papers were detailed observation logs. Names, dates, small notes about behavior, reactions to stimuli, the effectiveness of isolation. There were drawings too, rough sketches of patients' postures, of faces contorted in expressions of fear or pain. I turned a page and froze. The entry was marked in bold, almost frantic handwriting. The author wrote about subjects that never left. Names appeared repeatedly, month after month, then vanished from official records. Yet here in these notes they were not gone. They were remembered, meticulously catalogued. And somehow I could feel them, not just in memory but in the shadows, lingering. A soft scrape echoed behind me. I spun, flashlight beam cutting through the corridor. Nothing. And yet I felt it, the unmistakable brush of a presence, patient, watching, waiting. I whispered, trying to reassure myself, it's only me. It's only the building, my imagination. But the words felt hollow, swallowed by the oppressive silence. I continued down the hall, notebook and papers clutched tightly. The corridors twisted subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if the building itself wanted to guide me towards something. The further I went, the heavier the air became. Every breath felt like inhaling history, pain, and memory all at once. The whispers came again, faint, indistinct, curling around my mind, a constant reminder that I was not alone. At the far end of the corridor, a door slightly ajar caught my attention. I approached slowly, heart beating steadily but loud enough that I could hear it in my own ears. Pushing the door open, I discovered a room unlike the others. The walls were lined with metal cages, small and confining, each with remnants of bedding or restraints. The floor was scattered with papers, notebooks, and broken equipment, telltale signs of experiments, of attempts to control, to measure, to manipulate. I swallowed hard, stepping inside. Dust and decay mingled with something else, something colder, darker. I could feel it pressing at my awareness. I knelt and picked up a notebook from the floor. The handwriting was frantic, almost illegible in places. It described procedures that made my stomach turn, manipulations of the mind and body, prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation. Patients were recorded as responding to stimuli that had been invented by the staff. Yet some of them never emerged, never returned to the world outside these walls. The whispers grew slightly louder here, wrapping around my consciousness. I felt eyes on me, though I knew no one could be there. It was as if the memory of those who had suffered remained, watching, bound to the place that had defined the end of their lives. The air seemed thicker here, heavy with the weight of countless observations, countless silences, countless screams that were never recorded. I backed out slowly, feeling the presence follow me, always just beyond my perception. The corridor twisted again, subtly, leading me past doors I had already passed, as if the building refused to let me leave without seeing everything it had preserved. Every room told a story: the cruel experiment, the observation, the despair, and everywhere the lingering sense of those who had not survived, whose lives had been catalogued and forgotten by the world, but not by the asylum itself. I paused in the hall, taking notes, trying to ground myself. The journals, the whispers, the subtle pressure in the air, it all merged into a singular sensation. The asylum was alive in memory, patient, deliberate, and unyielding. I could feel it tracing my steps, nodding my movements, absorbing my presence as I absorbed its history. A faint movement at the edge of my vision made me spin. A shadow detached itself from the wall almost imperceptibly, then disappeared. I froze, listening. The soft whispers continued, curling around my mind, indistinct but unmistakable. It was not a threat, not in the sense of immediate danger, but a reminder. I was now part of the asylum's memory, a participant in its slow, deliberate observation. The hallway ahead narrowed, leading to another set of rooms. Each door, each window, each faint stain on the walls was a record, a testament, a lingering echo. I could almost see the patients, silent and watchful, remnants of their lives imprinted in the space. I could hear the softest brush of movement, the faintest echo of voices, but never words, never full sentences, only fragments, a mosaic of memory and presence. I took a deep breath, pushing forward carefully. My flashlight revealed more journals, more scraps of paper detailing cruel experiments. I could not read fast enough, could not absorb it all, but I could feel the weight of history pressing down. The whispers became rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, synchronized with my own. The air was alive with memory, patient, deliberate, and insistent. I stopped at the end of the corridor, feeling the oppressive weight of the asylum more keenly than ever. The presence was undeniable now, not in shadows or sounds alone, but in the very air around me. I felt observed, catalogued, measured in ways I could not articulate. The rooms I had passed, the journals I had read, the faintest impressions of those who had never left, all of it coalesced into a singular awareness. The asylum remembered, and it had not forgotten. As I turned to leave, the whispers seemed to follow, curling into my mind, faint but unmistakable. I understood then that I was no longer merely exploring history. I was part of it, observed, noted, and remembered in turn. The hidden wing, with its cruel experiments and lingering presence, had claimed a measure of me, subtle but undeniable. I moved slowly back toward the stairwell, each step measured, each breath deliberate. The weight of the past pressed against me, a constant companion. The corridors, the rooms, the lingering echoes, they would follow me, patient and insistent, until I had absorbed what the asylum intended to show. And as I ascended the stairwell, I knew I could never truly leave. The hidden wing, the patience, the journals, they had embedded themselves in my mind. The whispers, the footsteps, the subtle pressure of presence, they were now a part of me, patient, deliberate, and unyielding. The drive out of the city had been long, quiet, and almost hypnotic. I remember the way the streetlights thinned as we left the familiar glow of town behind, replaced by shadows and the occasional glimmer of headlights reflecting off slick asphalt. My wife, Mara, kept her hand on mine, warm and steady, though I could feel her own nerves in the way she pressed a little too firmly, like she was anchoring herself to something real. The GPS told us we had another 20 minutes to the cabin, but I knew it would take longer. Time stretched differently out here, surrounded by trees older than any building we'd ever known. We reached the turnoff just as the sun dipped behind the horizon. The last hints of pink and gold bleeding out across the sky. The road narrowed immediately, twisting and bending in ways that made my stomach twist too. Gravel crunched under the tires, echoing through the silent woods. I had driven in forests before, but something about this place felt different. There was a stillness that was heavier than quiet, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked into a clearing where the undergrowth had been cleared just enough to make a small yard. Its dark wood walls were almost invisible in the twilight, blending into the surrounding pines. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, though we knew the previous renters had supposedly left months ago. The air smelled of damp earth, pine resin, and something faintly metallic. I made a mental note of it but pushed the feeling aside. We were here to escape, to breathe differently, to feel life slower than city life would allow. Mara stepped out first, stretching and letting the quiet wash over her. She laughed softly at the way the cabin looked in the half-light, shadowed, welcoming, and yet just slightly off. I felt it too, a subtle wrongness, but I ignored it, focusing instead on unloading our bags. Inside, the cabin smelled of aged wood and faint dust. The furniture was rustic, sturdy, and arranged as though someone had been expecting guests. On the table there was a folded note. "Welcome. Make yourselves at home." No signature. I glanced at Mara. She shrugged, curious but unafraid. I tried to smile, but the note's sterile politeness felt strangely rehearsed, as if someone had written it for us in advance. We explored the room slowly. The living area had a fireplace with unburned logs stacked neatly. The kitchen was stocked with old utensils, cans, and jars, though nothing recent. Bedrooms were small but clean, beds made, blankets folded. Nothing looked abandoned, yet nothing looked truly lived in either. Mara commented on the cozy feel, and I nodded along, but I couldn't shake the sense that we were intruding on someone else's life. As night fell, the cabin seemed to change subtly. Shadows lengthened in ways that didn't make sense, stretching across the walls at odd angles. The wind whispered through the trees outside, scraping branches against the roof, and sometimes, just barely audible, I thought I could hear movement inside. Not footsteps exactly, but a shifting, scraping noise like the furniture was breathing, or settling in ways no building ever should. We made dinner quickly and ate by the dim light of lanterns. Mara laughed at small things, trying to keep the mood light. I wanted to join her, but my mind kept wandering. Every so often, I'd glance toward a corner of the room and swear a shadow had shifted, just enough to make me look again. The note, the smell, the silence of the woods outside, everything felt too precise, too calculated. After cleaning up, we settled into the living room, hopping to read or watch something on my phone. The silence stretched, oppressive in its own way. I began to notice little details. A door that seemed slightly ajar when we'd closed it, the faint smell of something damp and earthy coming from the hallway, and most unsettling, the sound of breathing that didn't belong to either of us. I told myself it was the cabin settling, the trees moving in the wind, or my imagination. Mara didn't hear it, or at least she didn't acknowledge it. I decided to check the bedrooms one more time before bed. Everything seemed normal, yet I felt compelled to touch the bed covers, adjust the pillows, and make sure no one had been here recently. And yet, the sense of being watched never left. I tried to rationalize it, the mind's way of filling silence with patterns, the echo of stories we'd heard about remote cabins. But rationality felt fragile here, easily cracked by the weight of the night and the stillness pressing from outside. Back in the living room, I noticed it for the first time, the other cabin across the clearing. I hadn't seen it clearly in the daylight, only now did its presence register fully. It was dark, silent, windows staring like eyes, and yet there was something about it that felt wrong. I squinted, trying to tell if it was abandoned or if someone was inside. Mara noticed my gaze and followed it. "Probably empty," she said. "Probably just another rental." But even as she said it, I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cool night air. We went to bed in our room, the door closed, lights dimmed. The darkness felt heavy, pressing down through the thin walls. I lay awake, listening. At first it was just the wind and the trees. Then faintly I heard it, the sound of a door opening somewhere in the cabin. Slow, deliberate. Not the creak of old wood, but something softer, heavier. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. My heart raced. I convinced myself it was a branch scraping the side of the cabin, a trick of the wind, and finally drifted into uneasy sleep. I woke hours later to the sound again, closer this time. The breathing, soft and deliberate, not mine. Mara slept beside me, unaware. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear more. Then a faint whisper, almost beneath the threshold of comprehension. "They're watching." I froze. The voice was not foreign but familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. Not words exactly, just syllables, shapes of sound that my brain tried to make sense of. I got out of bed carefully, flashlight in hand. The beam illuminated the room's familiar contours: bed, dresser, small chair in the corner. Nothing unusual, yet the oppressive feeling remained, as if the walls themselves were leaning in. The whisper came again, more insistent. "You shouldn't be here." I backed toward the door, feeling for Mara, trying to shake the sensation. She murmured in her sleep, unconsciously reaching for me. I pressed her hand, whispered that everything was fine, though I wasn't convinced. Together, we stayed in the room, lights on, listening. The whispering stopped, leaving only the wind outside, but the sense of being observed never left. By morning, the woods seemed more alive, more insistent. Birds moved silently through the treetops, shadows shifted with unnatural slowness. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of earth and something older, something decayed. I walked to the cabin's edge, trying to see the surrounding area, looking for signs of other people. No footprints, no smoke, nothing that indicated life beyond our own. Yet from the other cabin I felt a faint pressure, subtle and constant, like someone, or something, was there just out of sight. We decided to explore the area, rationalizing that our nerves were being played with by the isolation. The forest was dense, the paths unclear. Every step seemed to echo in ways that didn't match the distance traveled. I felt the trees lean slightly, shadows shifting at the edges of my vision. Mara joked about it, trying to keep the mood light, but even she flinched when a branch fell nearby with no wind to blame it on. By evening, I was certain we were being watched, not just by the forest but by something within the cabins themselves. The previous occupants, vanished months ago, seemed suddenly very real. I imagined them moving through the same hallways, breathing in the same stale air, wondering why we had come. Their absence was a presence, a weight pressing down on the night. We ate quickly, lighted the fireplace to create warmth and illusion, but sleep came reluctantly. The cabin moaned, settled, breathed in the way old wood does. But underneath that there was something else, a subtle, constant sound, as if footsteps passed behind closed doors. I stayed awake for hours, listening, recording my thoughts in a notebook I kept for sanity. The entries were simple: shadows move. The wind whispers. Something is here. We are not alone. I tried to reason it away. Imagination, nerves, exhaustion. But deep down, I knew that reasoning would not save me if the unseen presence decided it had noticed me fully. And then, just before sleep finally claimed me, I heard it clearly. A soft scraping at the other cabin. A door moved slightly in the wind. And again, the whisper, "They see you now." I didn't sleep after that. I lay awake, flashlight pointed at the door, listening to the wind, the trees, and the subtle sounds that were no longer just the wind. By morning, the forest seemed indifferent, but I could not shake the sense that we were already part of something that had begun long before we arrived. The cabin, the woods, the vanished occupants, they had marked this place, and now they had marked us. The morning after our first uneasy night in the cabin, the forest had transformed. Overnight, a thin layer of snow had settled across the clearing, covering the ground in a cold, white hush. It was beautiful at first glance, the kind of beauty that makes you forget the world outside, or at least temporarily. But there was something about it that made my stomach tighten, a subtle wrongness that I couldn't name. Mara was already outside, kneeling to scoop up snow in her gloved hands. She laughed lightly when she saw me at the door, holding the flashlight, still half drenched in shadows from the dim interior. "Look," she said, voice soft but tense, "it's like a winter wonderland. No one has been here for days, no footprints anywhere." She let the words hang there. I stepped into the cold, breathing in the crisp, icy air. The snow crunched beneath my boots, crisp and brittle. I followed Mara as she walked toward the edge of the clearing, stopping suddenly. My heart skipped. She pointed. There, across the yard, were footprints. They were large, human-sized, but there was no pattern, no consistency. One step here, 2 steps there. Some prints appeared to vanish mid-stride, as if the ground itself had swallowed them. I crouched to examine them. The snow had been undisturbed until this moment, yet these prints were clear, fresh, and utterly inexplicable. "Did you see anyone last night?" I asked, my voice low, careful. Mara shook her head. "No one," she said. Her face paled slightly. "It must have been the wind or the branches, something, but that makes no sense. Snow doesn't make footprints on its own." We spent the morning examining the edges of the clearing. The footprints were everywhere, but never leading anywhere specific. Some circled the cabin and disappeared into the woods. Others stopped abruptly in the middle of the snow, leaving nothing beyond. The more I stared, the more uneasy I became. Each time I thought I understood their direction, their purpose, the prints would shift slightly. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks, but the inconsistency was too deliberate, too precise. The sun climbed higher, but its weak winter light did little to warm the air. The forest itself seemed silent, as if holding its breath again, waiting. Every so often, a branch would snap far away, a hollow, resonant sound that made me jump, only to realize it was too distant to be anything more than nature. Still, the sound felt intentional, placed like a warning. By midday, we had returned to the cabin, trying to distract ourselves. Mara made tea while I watched the snow through the windows, the footprints now seemingly multiplying. Each time I looked away, new ones would appear. I told myself it was impossible, that I was imagining them, that the combination of isolation, wind, and fatigue was creating patterns my mind wanted to see. Mara tried to joke about it. Maybe it's tiny snow spirits, playful and mischievous. But her laughter was forced, brittle. I could hear it in the way she trailed off, looking past me toward the edge of the trees. As evening fell, the forest changed again. The long shadows of the trees stretched toward the cabin like dark fingers brushing the walls. The footprints persisted outside, and I felt compelled to follow them to understand their origin. Mara protested, anxious, but I convinced her to come along. We dressed in layers, took flashlights, and stepped into the cold once more. The snow crunched underfoot, each step louder than the last. We followed a set of prints that led into the trees. At first, they seemed to vanish among the roots and branches, but then they reappeared farther along, guiding us deeper into the forest. I felt a growing pressure in my chest, the sensation of eyes watching us from the shadows. My mind tried to reason it. Deer, other hikers, tracks from long ago. But the prints were too deliberate, too human, and too inconsistent. A sudden sound froze us both. A faint scraping noise came from deeper in the trees. Not a branch falling, not the wind, but the slow, methodical dragging of something along the snow. We froze. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing beyond the nearest trunks. Mara's breath came in shallow, quick bursts. She whispered, "It's just the wind, it's just the wind." But the scraping came again, closer this time, from the left, then the right, as if circling us. The footprints shifted again. One path led back toward the cabin, another deeper into the forest, and then a set seemed to vanish mid-step, swallowed by the snow, leaving nothing. I wanted to turn back, to retreat, but curiosity, or something darker, rooted me to the spot. Mara tugged at my arm, her voice trembling now, pleading. "We need to go back, please, something's wrong." I nodded reluctantly. We retraced our steps, following the prints that led toward home, only to discover they had multiplied, crisscrossing in impossible directions, making the forest feel smaller, tighter, claustrophobic. Back at the cabin, we lit the fireplace, huddling close as darkness fell outside. The footprints seemed to circle the cabin now, appearing at irregular intervals, each new print accompanied by faint, unidentifiable sounds, scraping, whispering, sometimes soft sighs. The snow was perfect otherwise, untouched, yet these prints persisted, appearing in places that made no sense. That night, sleep became impossible. Every so often Mara stirred, whispering in her sleep, almost calling out. The scratching, shuffling sounds continued outside, circling, moving. I tried to convince myself it was wind or animals, but the pattern was deliberate, intentional. Every so often, I thought I could see shapes moving beyond the windows, fleeting shadows that vanished when I blinked. Hours passed. The fireplace burned low, casting a soft glow, and the snow outside reflected it in a pale, eerie light. I stayed awake, recording our observations, trying to make sense of it all. The journal I kept grew messy, filled with sketches of footprints and arrows showing impossible directions. The more I recorded, the more they seemed to shift, as if aware, as if mocking us. At one point I heard a faint whisper, so soft I thought I imagined it. "They are close." My stomach churned. Mara stirred again, murmuring, but did not wake fully. I held my hand over hers, trying to reassure both of us, though I felt no comfort. The whispers returned, repeating, "Impossible to locate." Behind the cabin, in the trees, sometimes even inside the cabin itself, though every door and window was firmly shut. Morning brought no relief. The footprints were everywhere again, fresh and sharp in the newly fallen snow. Some led into the woods, some toward the other cabin across the clearing, and some appeared to end abruptly, as if the snow itself had swallowed them. I considered leaving, but something kept me rooted. A mixture of fear, curiosity, and the unexplainable insistence that we were meant to see this, to witness it. We decided to explore the perimeter once more, this time cautiously, keeping flashlights trained on the snow. The forest seemed to lean closer, every shadow elongated, every sound amplified. Branches scraped overhead, but there was no wind. Every so often, a branch would snap from a distance too precise to be random. The footprints sometimes appeared in pairs, sometimes single, and always inconsistent. I felt eyes on us constantly, though I could never see them. By the time night returned, I was exhausted, yet sleep remained impossible. The whispers grew bolder, almost intelligible now. Shapes moved in the trees, dark and quick, vanishing when I tried to focus. Every so often, the footprints seemed to encroach closer, surrounding the cabin, leaving no clear path out. Mara remained close, whispering reassurances that did little to calm me. I realized then that these were not ordinary tracks, not the work of animals or people. They were deliberate, precise, and purposeful. And though we were the only living beings in the clearing, the footprints suggested otherwise. Someone or something had been here long before us, and was still here, watching. The wind moaned faintly, brushing the trees against the cabin walls. The footprints continued their endless dance, appearing, vanishing, reappearing. The whispers persisted, faint but undeniable. I scribbled another entry in my notebook. "We are being watched. They are moving. We are not alone." Sleep never came again that night. We woke to another gray morning, the kind that made the forest feel heavier than usual, as if the trees themselves were pressing down on the cabin. The snow still lay thick across the clearing, and the footprints had multiplied overnight. They circled the cabin, some near the windows, others along the side trail that led back toward the road. The pattern was impossible to follow, endless and looping. Each new morning brought a fresh layer of disquiet, an unspoken insistence that we were not welcome, that the forest would not let us go. Mara was quiet as we packed. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled when she bundled our bags. I wanted to tell her that leaving would solve everything, that once we returned to civilization, the footprints, the whispers, the feeling of being watched would vanish. But something in my gut told me that wouldn't happen, that the forest had already marked us in a way we could not undo. We stepped onto the path leading out of the clearing, the snow soft beneath our boots. For a brief moment the world seemed ordinary. Sunlight filtered weakly through the branches, the air crisp and clear. But then the path shifted. Not literally, there was no physical change, but the orientation of the trees, the angles of the trail, the distances between landmarks all seemed subtly wrong. I stopped, blinking, trying to reconcile what I saw with what I remembered from the previous day. Mara noticed my hesitation. "Are you okay?" she asked. Her voice was tight, cautious. I nodded, though my unease only grew. "Yeah, just need a second." I tried to map the trail in my mind, but every step felt heavier, the forest denser, the silence around us more oppressive. The sounds of wildlife, the occasional bird or rustle of small animals, had vanished. In their place was a near-complete absence of sound, the kind that makes every small movement feel amplified. We walked on, following the path we thought led back to the road. But hours passed, and we encountered the same strange footprints we had seen around the cabin, now crisscrossing the trail. Some prints were ours, clear and deep, Others appeared fresh, yet in shapes and sizes that did not match either of us. I stopped to inspect one set. They were human-sized, heavy, pressing deep into the snow. But no footprints led up to them and none led away. The trail began and ended abruptly, like something had materialized from the forest itself. I said nothing at first, not wanting to alarm Mara, but she noticed my expression. "What is it?" she asked softly. I pointed at the snow. These aren't ours. They shouldn't be here." Mara looked, her face pale, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "We need to go back. She trailed off, but I knew what she meant. The forest had other plans. As we moved deeper into the trees, I realized that the forest was no longer neutral. The trees seemed to lean toward us, branches brushing our shoulders when there was no wind. The trail curved in ways that defied logic. A path we had walked moments ago now looked different. Landmarks shifted slightly, trunks appearing closer or farther than memory suggested. I tried to keep track, but the forest refused my maps, my reason, my sense of direction. We stopped for water, crouching beside a snow-covered rock. The silence pressed against us, thick and almost tactile. I glanced around, noticing shadows where none should be. Some were long and thin, others squat and irregular, flickering as if they were aware of our presence. Mara shivered beside me. "I feel like we're not walking through the forest," she whispered. "I feel like the forest is walking through us." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as fear, but the sensation was undeniable. Every step we took seemed anticipated, every misstep corrected by the forest itself. Snow that had been soft and yielding hardened in patches, forcing us to slow, to stumble, to recalibrate. The trail ahead appeared familiar yet subtly wrong, like a memory that had been altered while we slept. We pressed on, determined to find the road. Hours, or perhaps more, it was impossible to tell passed. The sun sank lower, though the sky seemed oddly unchanged, caught in a permanent gray. The footprints multiplied, some appearing behind us, some beside us, though we had no clear sense of who or what made them. Some prints were small, delicate, childlike. Others were massive, pressing deep into the snow as though something heavy and purposeful had walked. And yet we never glimpsed the source. By mid-afternoon, fatigue weighed heavily on us. Mara's movement slowed, and her breaths came in short, shallow bursts. I tried to keep my own fear at bay, focusing on forward motion, on counting steps, on anything to maintain a sense of reality. But the forest mocked me. The same tree we passed earlier now loomed at an impossible angle. The snow that had appeared freshly fallen hours ago now seemed trampled, layered with tracks that had no source. My heart raced, my mind spinning. Suddenly we reached a small clearing, though it felt like we had seen it before. A thick fog hugged the ground, curling around the bases of the trees. We saw movement, quick and fleeting, in the fog's edge. Something darted between the trunks, just out of reach, disappearing before our eyes could focus. I froze, shining the flashlight toward it, but the beam only caught the empty mist. Mara grabbed my arm. "We can't stop," she said urgently. They're watching us. We have to keep moving." We pushed forward, stepping into the fog. Each footfall echoed strangely, as if the snow and air themselves were amplifying it, reflecting it back at us. The footprints continued, now layered on top of our own, overlapping in impossible ways. Some prints led straight ahead, others circled back behind us, appearing even as we moved forward. The forest had become a labyrinth, a living entity guiding us deeper into its heart. Night fell, or at least what we assumed was night. The gray sky became darker, though no stars or moon appeared. The trees closed in, dense and oppressive. The footprints no longer appeared at regular intervals. They darted and shifted unpredictably, always placing us at the center of some unseen pattern. The forest seemed alive, aware, intent. Every rustle, every snap of a branch, every faint whispering sound pressed against us like a tangible weight. Mara's whispers grew panicked. I can't do this. We're going in circles. We'll never get out." I tried to reassure her, but my own voice felt hollow. My own fears mirrored hers. We had been walking for what felt like hours, yet every time we thought we approached the edge of the forest, every time a break in the trees suggested freedom, the path shifted, folded, altered. It was impossible to measure distance or time. A sudden noise made us both stop. A low, deliberate scraping in the snow, coming from all around us, circling. The fog thickened, curling like fingers around our legs. I tried to shine the flashlight, but the light scattered, diffused in the mist. Shapes flickered at the periphery, impossible to identify, never fully materializing. And the footprints, they pressed in every direction, some ending abruptly, some curving impossibly, as though the forest itself had rearranged the ground beneath us. We stumbled, disoriented, trying to navigate by memory, by instinct, by hope. Every familiar tree appeared altered, every slope misleading. The snow was a shifting canvas, imprinted with tracks that defied logic, yet suggested an intelligence behind them. We were trapped in a pattern we could not break, the forest folding in around us, a living labyrinth with no exit. Hours or maybe minutes later, we collapsed in a small hollow, exhausted and trembling. Mara's face was streaked with tears, her breath shallow and rapid. I held her close, whispering reassurances, though I felt none myself. The forest was patient, observing, and we were now just pieces in its quiet, intricate design. I glanced around the hollow, noting the footprints once more. Some led to us, some away, and some ended mid-step, as though whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. The realization settled in. We were not meant to leave. We were part of the forest now, guided, trapped, observed. Our fate uncertain, yet inevitable. I held Mara tightly, staring into the fog-shrouded trees. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented, calling our names in a way that suggested neither malice nor friendliness, only an inescapable inevitability. The snow, the trees, the tracks, they were all connected, forming a pattern we could never decipher, a presence that was patient and unyielding. Morning, or what we assumed to be morning, came and the forest remained unchanged. The footprints continued, circling, layering over one another, guiding us deeper still. We tried to mark our path, to break the pattern, but the snow erased every mark almost instantly. The forest would not let us leave. And so we walked on. The road back no longer existed in any form we recognized. The clearing where the cabin stood was gone, replaced by trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The snow remained, the footprints multiplied, and the whispers never ceased. Every step brought us further from the world we knew, deeper into something alive, something ancient, something patient. We were not lost, we had been found. And the forest would not release us.